Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special Waterloo Day stream with my very special guest, Rupert and Furius Pertinax.
Hello, thanks for having me on again.
I always do that.
Oh.
Sorry.
Indeed.
Yeah, with my special guest, Rupert and Furius Pertinax. As I always do with these things, I'm going to start us off with a tune which will get people a chance to get in and so on. Bum, bum, bum.
When battle roused each warlike band, and carnage loud her trumpet blew, young Edwin left his native land, a drummer boy for Waterloo. His mother, when his lips she pressed, and bade her noble boy adieu, with wringing hands and aching breast, beheld him march for Waterloo. But he who knew not infant fears, his knapsack over his shoulder threw, he cried, "Dear mother, dry those tears, till I return from Waterloo." He went, and ere the setting sun beheld the foe their arms subdue, the flash of death, the murderous gun, had laid him low at Waterloo. "Oh, comrades, comrades," Edwin cried, and proudly beamed his eye of blue, "go tell my mother Edwin died a soldier's death at Waterloo." They laid his head upon his drum, beneath the pale moon's mournful hue. When night had stilled the battle's hum, they dug his grave at Waterloo.
Quite a touching little tune, that, Iron Duke. I'd actually never heard that before.
Yeah, no, that was a new one for me. It was from Patriot Archives, excellent channel. Go and check him out. I see he's in the chat. And the painting there was the Coldstream Guards at Huguenot at Waterloo. And you always have to love a guards officer in white gloves. So, all right, guys. I'm just going to put up a map of the 100 Days campaign, which is the best one I've been able to find. I think it's this one. Yeah, that's probably the one I want. And then we will get on with the discussion. Where are we? Must be.
Well, I mean, even before that, it's probably worth quickly touching on how they sort of got into that position in the first place.
Yep. Go ahead, Rupert. You're the diplomatic and political expert here, as far as I know.
Well, Napoleon had been forced to abdicate prior due to the invasion of France, so he was pressed into abdicating, and then he was exiled to the island of Elba. But then, when he found the opportunity, because he still had a sort of honor guard with him, he was able to abscond, land back in France covertly, and then sort of made his way north. Initially, he was intercepted by Ney, and an army that was sent by the restored Bourbons, but the army, either the commander or the army, and taking the commander with them, taking Ney with them, defected en masse to Napoleon, and sort of at that point the Bourbons, well, Louis XVIII in particular, sort of lost his nerve and decided that he thought his chances were better outside of the country, and Napoleon reassumed power. But there's a couple of things that were still sort of ongoing at the time, which kind of made it relatively untenable from the get-go. Any kind of like restoration is that the Congress of Vienna was still sort of ongoing, and the various powers were still in more or less full mobilization, because they were still sort of determining what to actually do with France and what the treaty settlement should be in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic calamity from the point of view of the rest of Europe. And so there was still quite a significant amount of troops in the area, despite the fact that I believe quite a few of the main British forces had been transferred over to America to fight the War of 1812 over there.
Yes, absolutely true. Yeah, most of Wellington's best troops were still in North America when the Waterloo campaign broke out.
Yeah. So it's often said that the long-term effect of this whole sort of like intervening calamity is not so great, because it didn't actually affect the proceedings in Vienna all that much. They were trying to figure out at the time what to actually do with France, and how the future should look for France and the west of Europe and the rest of Europe at large. And that was basically not affected particularly greatly by Napoleon at all, except in the fact that it made France's negotiating position a little bit weaker, arguably, in terms of it just sort of put a hold on everything, and then demonstrated the fact that France is still a power that couldn't be trusted, and just because the Bourbons are back in charge doesn't necessarily mean that they can be treated as a proper power. Although ultimately that is sort of how it resolved itself in the end, or how it was resolved in the end.
Well, Talleyrand did very well at the Congress of Vienna, and kind of put France in a relatively strong position.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that happened that sort of helped him along, but it is interesting the extent to which Talleyrand himself just being around is probably enough to change history fairly significantly, insofar as I don't believe he was actually there to represent France officially, because France officially was not supposed to have any particular representation there. But while he was present in his own capacity, just as Talleyrand, basically, he was able to argue the French perspective inside the room, despite them having lost the war, essentially.
Yeah.
Not essentially outright. They had lost the war, but.
Well, also, I'll just remind the audience that obviously today is Waterloo Day in terms of the British date. It's the 18th of June, and Napoleon arrived back from Elba in France in March, and he did actually perform wonders in terms of organising his army and what have you in the short time that he had.
Yeah, I mean, for a little bit more background, though, one of the things that did help him along is that enough time had passed in between his original abdication and his return for the 100 Days, that quite a few of his troops that had been left, either left behind to some degree, either in Russia or in Germany or elsewhere, or else taken prisoner, were actually released. And because the Napoleonic base, as it were, the political base of Napoleon was basically always his army, the army was far more Napoleonic, liberal, I suppose, and like pro-revolutionary than or anti-Bourbon, perhaps even, than the rest of the wider civilian society. The fact that Napoleon was forced out at a time when all those troops weren't present, and they were brought back, and then all of a sudden Napoleon has this sort of like nascent support base that he didn't have when he was forced out. So he does actually have something to come back to, and there's
almost like a political second wind of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. Literally just because of his supporters, who physically hadn't been in the country prior, were brought back, and so they were ready to sort of like reaccept him. But
and also the other thing I think is worth noting is that in 1813, Napoleon had fought a brilliant campaign. It was everyone, I think, most military historians anyway, would say it was his best campaign since his early days as a commander. But because of the huge losses of horses in Russia, he really lacked cavalry in 1813, and so wasn't really able to turn any of his tactical victories into anything very decisive. Whereas in the Waterloo campaign, he once again had a strong cavalry arm.
There is another factor in that earlier on in the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, the opposition to Napoleon had been relatively fragmented in terms of the domestic opposition. But as time goes on, they get more and more well organized and become like a proper institution unto themselves. Such that when France is actually invaded, they have the ability to basically be the negotiating face of Bourbon France in a sense. So although it isn't the government that ends up negotiating on behalf of France, Talleyrand himself sets up a provisional government with a number of defecting Napoleonic officials and administrators and such. But on the ground, there is a very effective monarchist opposition that's already developed, which will later go on to become the Ultras. But at the time, it was a secret society called the Knights of the Faith.
Before I ask Furius to give us his views on this early stage of the 100 Days campaign, you were saying before we started, Rupert, that obviously Napoleon had various armies of observation he had to put around in various parts of France, like in the south of France, etc., to guard against the Spanish, Portuguese, and what have you. But you were also saying another important thing was there was another rebellion in the Vendée, which he had to send troops to.
Yeah, so quite famously, there was one of the most major, or one of the biggest poles of counter-revolutionary activity and like monarchist activity against the revolution in general was in the Vendée, and it is actually marked on the map there. And when Napoleon returned for the 100 Days, there was actually another uprising in the Vendée, such that, and it was big enough and sort of concerning enough that Napoleon did actually have to send around, I believe it was a third of all of the troops that he raised for his new army. Did end up having to go and try and quell the rebellion in the Vendée. I think that was between 40 and 70,000 troops or something like that, some pretty significant amount. But there's another angle to this as well. This is why I mentioned the Knights of the Faith and the fact that they become so organized, is because towards the end of the war, and then towards the end of the First War, and then into the 100 Days, there was actually such an efficient organization of like surveillance and networking and sort of like message communication that they could pass a message or like military intelligence or just any kind of message that they wanted to faster than the imperial postage service could. So literally they could let their allies and their members know what was going on before Napoleon himself even knew.
That is interesting. Furius, what's your take on this, like the opening phase of the 100 Days campaign?
Well, I think you guys have more or less canvassed it, but what I will say is that what is interesting about this, this little snapshot of history, because it's always, I suppose, the inkling of people who are interested in history to sort of ask themselves or to contest the question, like, what is it that make these great men great as such? And I think it's sort of doubtless to look at someone like Napoleon, who obviously had this massively transformative impact, not just on France, but on the entirety of Europe, throughout his lifetime. And that instance where Ney intercepts him in southern France, with these, I think it's a couple of regiments that are dispatched, if memory serves me correct. And
he was supposed to bring him back in an iron cage.
Correct. And then you sort of have this, and I love how it's portrayed in the movie, the one with Rob's is it Steiger or Steiger, whatever his name is.
Rod Steiger, yeah.
Rod Steiger, and these French troops are toffing their hat and vive l'empereur, vive l'empereur, and these troops that were dispatched to imprison him just join him and sort of add this sort of, what we term, or what I use the word a second political wind, but what sort of is this resurgence essentially of this Napoleonic mythos, and that takes a degree of what you might call gravitas. And even though Napoleon was a defeated leader of France and a defeated general in the face of these, what ends up being several coalition wars. And it's this final one, in the aftermath of the Russia campaign that eventually, dethrones Napoleon, that literally within a calendar year, Napoleon finds himself in a position where between his own ambition and the desire of his supporters, he's actually back in a position where he, leads France. He ousts entirely this sort of nascent new regime that has been put in place of Napoleon and his regime, and he just almost, I don't want to say effortlessly, because it obviously wasn't effortless, but he quite easily brushes them aside and becomes the center of France once again. I doubt that history will ever demonstrate another example of this. Certainly in our lifetimes. But it's just one of those things that I find monumental in history. And just Napoleon, when you look at the mythos of his life and the kind of character he was, and the way that Napoleon had this sort of almost ability to inspire great zeal in his supporters.
He's certainly an example of Caesarism, isn't he? I mean, Napoleon he's certainly an example of Caesarism for sure.
I was almost trying to avoid using the connotation, but exactly right. He embodies this notion of Caesarism in a very strong way. And I mean, we even see like in his artwork, there's doubtless that sort of strain that runs through the way he portrays himself, particularly once he becomes emperor. And the way
I don't think the Eagles were an accident either. I don't think the French Eagles were an accident. So.
They were very much a harkening back to the idea of the Legion, most certainly.
What can I just say before you go on there, Rupert? Because I'm watching the chat. Yes, Wellington was offered the command in North America, and yes, he did refuse it because he said, "What the devil is there to attack?" The British Army captured Washington D.C. They burnt the White House and all the rest of it. What was Wellington supposed to do there? Exactly, was his opinion. But most of his best troops had still not returned. So at Waterloo, he had quite a lot of second battalions. Who were generally less experienced. A lot of his Peninsula veterans, an army with which Wellington said he could go anywhere and do anything, were not back by the time of the Waterloo campaign. And he notably said, "I have an infamous army, and we're not going to do this now, but in a bit you'll find out why." Because he actually did have a pretty infamous army at Waterloo. Also, someone in the chat was saying, "Were a third of the British Army of Waterloo Irish?" No, that's too much. Up to about a quarter might have been, but that would be about the most. And as Brian Borrow pointed out in the chat, there were several very good Irish regiments, including 2 very good Irish cavalry regiments at Waterloo. Sorry, Rupert, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but otherwise I was going to miss those chats. So carry on, mate.
Yeah, no problem. Just I was going to say one of the things that did help him in his reascension to power, though, is that quite a lot of the men who had been so quick to leave him the first time around and force him into exile then were just as quick to sort of jump back on. And I think that's probably one of the most enduring legacies of the 100 Days, other than obviously the remembrance and the glorification of the Battle of Waterloo and all that sort of thing. For like the immediate political purposes, the fact that so many men had been sort of willing to then jump immediately back on and rejoin Napoleon after having ostensibly, forsworn him and sworn him off and pledged allegiance to Louis XVIII. That was a very, enlightening moment for quite a lot of the more radical members of groups like the Knights of the Faith and later the Ultras and the general monarchist feeling in France. Because it generated a lot of fear of crypto Bonapartists and sort of like crypto revolutionaries and all that sort of thing, and that comes around in a very big way later on.
Yeah, absolutely true. Mitch, yes, you're correct. He was Corsican, and I believe Frenchmen always said he had a Corsican accent all his life. Also, someone in the chat said many of the Peninsula veterans met their end at New Orleans. That's not actually true. Tom Pakenham, who was Wellington's brother-in-law and a very brave officer, but not the bravest tool in the shed, it was only really a brigade that got cut up at New Orleans. It wasn't like most of the Peninsula Army, which actually by the end of the Peninsula War was like 40,000 strong. So,
I was going to mention New Orleans actually. I wonder if had Wellington been over there commanding himself, then maybe New Orleans would have been less of a debacle.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, the other thing to remember is that the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the peace had been signed, so it wouldn't.
I was going to say not that it would have made that much difference to the actual outcome of the war, but it probably would have humbled the Americans a lot more, because that sort of allowed them to spin it in the national consciousness as a war.
Yeah. Whereas in fact, of course, they invaded Canada 3 times and got defeated 3 times, and Britain had also captured their capital. So and on top of that, what really caused the peace treaty was that the Royal Navy was totally blockading the American East Coast, and all their trade basically stopped. Every single American warship was either captured or blockaded in port and couldn't even get out.
Well, also, I believe the British had sort of decided that there wasn't actually anything else that they wanted from the war, so they didn't really care to make any demands, because they were trying to stave off Prussian and Russian land claims in the east, so they wanted to be able to sort of claim themselves as being just a status quo antebellum. A seeker of the status quo antebellum, basically.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I will just say before we go on, Brian Borrow, Patrick Masterson was an Irish sergeant who captured an eagle. And yes, he did indeed say, "Bejabbers, boys, I have the cuckoo," which I think was brilliant. And of course, another eagle was captured at Waterloo by Sergeant William Hewitt of the Scots Greys, the Scottish Heavy Cavalry Regiment. And he was commissioned for that. And I believe if you're in Edinburgh, just below Edinburgh Castle, there's still a pub named after him. And his son was also an officer in the Scots Greys later on. I will also say that, I agree with Rupert that had Wellington been at New Orleans, I don't think he would have fallen for the silly trap that Pakenham fell for. But, there we go. Like I said, Pakenham was a very brave man, but he wasn't the most tactical genius one I'd ever met.
It's why often bravery should be met with a degree of intelligence in an officer, but that often doesn't quite pan out in history, does it, Mr. Hines?
Indeed. Just because you're brave doesn't mean you're intelligent. Some men are both. Wellington, for example, I would argue, was pretty brave and intelligent. But he was nearly always in the most fierce part of the battle, because that's where he needed to be to control things.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else to say about the political side, the opening, Napoleon raising his army, or anything like that before we move on to the actual 100 days military campaign?
I don't have a lot more to say. I'll probably touch on this more towards the end, but just I suppose to fill in this bit of a void, I will say that there is a large part of me that, even though I sort of admire the dashing bravado of Napoleon wrestling power back in France, I think it's most people in our situation would be analyzing this, in the fullness of time, would realize that short of an absolute calamity and being, pardon the way I phrase this, but unless they were completely handed their arse by Napoleon, I do doubt that the Seventh Coalition would have made peace with France under any situation when Napoleon retains power. I think once they had resolved to exile him to Elba the first time, and seen to put the Bourbons back in power in France, after the end of the coalition wars, I just don't think there would have been a situation where, like I say, in the absence of a total Napoleonic victory, which I would find highly unlikely, I don't know if they would have been satisfied that even in the event of a Napoleonic victory at Waterloo, the Austrians and the Russians were still going to arrive at some point. So I don't know how well conceived this was by Napoleon, but it's still brave nonetheless. And I think it's still one of those very interesting sort of hinge points in history that is worthy of analysis.
If he'd have beaten, we'll get onto this in a minute. He beat Blucher at Ligny, and Wellington, as a result, had to retreat from Quatre. But had he broken Wellington at Waterloo, he would then have captured Brussels. And now, if he'd have captured Brussels, there was a lot of French sympathy amongst the Dutch in those days. And I think the war would have gone on for quite a while. But as you rightly say, Furius, the Russians and the Austrians were going to be arriving with big armies. There was a chance that the Spanish and Portuguese might have arrived, which would have made the French very, very unhappy. Because when Wellington invaded the south of France in 1814, he deliberately left his Spanish troops behind because he knew what they were going to do to the French. So, yeah, in the long term, I was talking to Rupert about this before we started streaming. In the long term, Napoleon's prospects were not good.
Yeah, I mean, he would have. Oh, sorry, Rupert. I was just going to say quickly, like he would have literally needed like 3 Austerlitz in a calendar year, to have any chance of prevailing. But sorry, Rupert, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, there was what 250,000 Russians that he had to deal with next if he had somehow won Waterloo. And that's partly why I emphasize the rising in the Vendée, is because that did cause him to lose a lot of troops. And so had he had access to those troops and had the home front not been such a problem for him to manage sort of domestic issues, then perhaps he could have won Waterloo. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, there isn't really a viable path to victory in the campaign as a whole.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'd like to say, Mitch, if this feels like an apostolic majesty stream, I shall take that as an extreme compliment. And I'd also like to say hello to Nathan CJ Hood in the chat. Another good channel. Go and check him out, guys. Yeah. All right. So sorry.
One other quick thing though, just on a point that was raised earlier, but I didn't sort of chime in with the point that I had to make on it. But I mean, it does. It comes back around this sort of like this whole folly, basically, of just showing up almost for his own glory in like completely hopeless circumstances. I do have to wonder if anyone that had actually been French could have been so reckless with French lives.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all, to be honest with you. I mean, again, as we were saying in the chat before, we were chatting before we went live, in 1813, even, Napoleon could have had France's old borders with himself still as emperor. And he refused.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing just kind of reeks of a carelessness, and I can't help but ascribe that, at least in part, to the fact that he was not a Frenchman, but ruling a lot of French people, and so he just doesn't care as much about about their lives. Would be my reading, and well, I think that's a trend that sort of repeats a few times in history as well.
Yeah, one of the contrasts I make between Wellington and Napoleon. Now, Napoleon was probably more loved by his troops than Wellington was, but Wellington was trusted by his troops because his troops knew he would not get them killed needlessly. He was always very careful with his troops' lives, and indeed he had to be because the British Army wasn't all that big. Whereas Napoleon, of course, had as many men as he could call up.
And it's also one of those things too, whereby, Napoleon throughout his career shows this knack, and I think you see it in great people. I think one of the greatest exponents of it would be sort of Alexander to some extent. Is that once a leader, be they a general or whatever, but it's obviously in this case we're talking in the context general, who also happens to be the nation's leader. Once they start to believe their own mythology, it becomes a liability for the men who follow them. And, like Napoleon's one of those figures in history that, one can say, yes, he was tactically brilliant, particularly at the very start and the very end of his career. That he was, when he did fight under fire, he was brave. Yes, he was, tactically adept, and he did, in his own way, revolutionize warfare in the same way that Alexander did, in the same way that Caesar did, the same way as several of these men across history do. Genghis Khan is another example of that. But Napoleon, probably more than anyone, certainly anyone since Alexander, starts to believe his own mythos. And that becomes his problem, and it becomes a liability for his men. This is why, or at least to an extent, this is why I believe he's so reckless with the lives of his men in the 1812 campaign in Russia. And even say, for example, where, you've rightly cited here, Iron Duke, his those offers made to France via the negotiations of Talleyrand to remain in power in France. with France's, old borders, albeit larger borders than what it ended up with, intact. And Napoleon says no, even though he has the entirety of this coalition bearing down on him, and then eventually loses the Battle of Leipzig in 1913, the so-called Battle of the Nations, and then seeks to sort of engage in this. On one hand, it's a miraculous campaign, but this very futile campaign defending the borders of France with, scraps of his army left, and then finds himself out of power. And then, again, there's this whole 100 Days campaign to bring himself back into power in France when the coalition's armies are still largely mobilized. And at this point, as I said before, the coalition had essentially, reckoned to be done with Napoleon and not let him take charge of France again. How many Frenchmen died as a result of Napoleon pursuing his own sort of ego? And I think that's the great tragedy for the French in this respect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that word, Rupert.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about before, just before the show, France sort of demographically and you could probably say economically as well, never actually recovers from this period. And a large part of that can be just attributed to the fact that there's a complete carelessness towards life that just had not existed prior to the revolution.
Yeah. I mean, even by 1914, the French had not recovered demographically from Napoleon's wars. So, he killed an awful lot of Frenchmen. Someone in the chat said, I guess Wellington kept his soldiers' bellies full. Yes, Wellington was very careful with supplies, and was also aware that if you didn't provide your troops with sufficient supplies, they would go off marauding and stealing. And the whole Napoleonic military ethos was basically living off the land. Yes, Napoleon would try and provide his troops with bread, which was really, a lot of it was like twice baked biscuit stuff. He would provide some basic supplies, but in general terms, the whole Napoleonic and Revolutionary War ethos was you lived off the land, which was basically stealing and murdering from the peasants and the farmers and the rest of it, whose land you were going through, which of course didn't work very well in Russia in 1812, when they were going through areas where there weren't many peasants and farmers, and the Russians had also been careful to either remove or destroy stuff.
Yeah, the Russians basically engaged in, as the Russians generally do in their defensive wars, scorched earth. So that gave Napoleon's forces, precious little to draw upon on the land. But just in respect to that, this is another aspect that makes Napoleon's army, I hate to use the word revolution in this context, but makes his military developments revolutionary, in purely military terms, is that Napoleon doesn't march around with much of a supply train. His dedication to rapidity and mobility is emphasized time and again, and particularly when he engages in the war with Prussia and he overruns them at Austerlitz, at Ulm, at Jena. He does this just through impressive, almost blindsided marches at great speed, where he just overwhelms his own opposition. And he also does it in a couple of his campaigns against the Austrians. He just simply wins by intelligent maneuver and also speed. But the only way that can be accomplished in this time period historically is by not having a supply train. So Napoleon's troops, more than even his contemporaries, were reliant on actually living off the land via say the British army, via the Russian army, or even the Prussian army, who would have had more supplies on hand than say the French army would have done.
Yeah, absolutely true. I will just point out Mitchie's comment in the chat. The British population grew by 68% between 1800 and 1914. Germany grew by 87%, while in France in the same period it was only 8%.
Wow.
And that was a direct result of all the Frenchmen who were killed by Napoleon. So, because there was no mass immigration in those days to any of those countries, including Britain, by the way. But yeah,
and of course, not to abide by sort of line go up economics here, but without doubt, at this point in time, with the Industrial Revolution and all the things that go with that, and with urbanization, etc., that much for just different differentiation in population growth has an economic impact as well. There seems like not enough factory workers, and there's not enough agricultural, hands to to carry increases in productivity, which we've seen in places like Britain and Germany at this time. So doubtlessly would have held back France in a material, from a material standpoint as well.
Yeah. Rupert, anything to add on that stuff?
No, nothing to add. Yeah, pretty much. I think we pretty much covered everything.
Okay. Look, what I think we're going to do now, the map that is up there, which if you guys maximize your screen, you should be able to roughly see. I think I'll probably ask Furius about this. Napoleon's plan, as far as I can work out, was he wanted to defeat the two armies that were closest to France, which was the British army, which was really an allied army, which we'll go into in a minute, or I will anyway, and the Prussian army. And he wanted to defeat those guys in detail, which is to say he really wanted to amass all his forces and beat one and then beat the other. But because Wellington and Blucher trusted each other, they weren't all that far apart. So he was always going to have a problem here. Furious, I know this is your kind of stuff. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, that's right. Whenever you look at, yeah, exactly. You raise a really good point there, and indeed, for the majority of the time in which Napoleon's marching into the Waterloo area, and Blucher and Wellington are also converging to where Napoleon is. Blucher and Wellington are hardly more than a day or day and a half's march apart. For instance, where Napoleon does give the Prussians a bloody nose at Ligny, even though they retreat, and I suppose we'll get into this in some detail a bit later, and obviously Napoleon dispatches Grouchy with a corps, a 30,000 strong corps to pursue the Prussians, which obviously doesn't pan out for them because he doesn't follow the guns. But the Blucher and Wellington are sort of always conscientious to be within literally earshot of each other. So if someone hears the guns, the other army marches to support the ally. And this is obviously evident in how the Battle of Waterloo does transpire, is that, Blucher and the Prussians hear the guns, they sort of rally their forces that are still reeling from Ligny. They, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of, they reform and recoalesce and then march to Napoleon's flank. And that would have been not possible if they were further than, if they were, say, 2+ days march from each other. That just would not have been feasible.
100%. Yeah, totally agree with that. I will just say to people in the chat, if you've got questions for anyone on the panel, if you look at the top of the chat, there is a pinned link, which is for Entropy, where you can send a super chat, and we'll do that at the end of the stream if you have any questions. Rupert, your thoughts on that?
I was just going to say one other little bit of cunning diplomacy that I was just reminded about was that when so after Napoleon had returned and he was reassumed power, the declaration of war that was made by the coalition forces was not actually against France itself; it was against Napoleon personally.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, just an interesting little quirk.
I actually wasn't aware of that. It's a nice little fact, Rupert.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I knew that, but I think even the movie Waterloo mentions it and says they're treating you as a country sire or something like that. So
yeah,
and the movie Waterloo, by the way, is pretty good. There's a lot of historical mistakes in it, a lot, but it's not a bad film. And I like Christopher Plummer as Wellington. I think he does very well as Wellington, to be honest with you. So there you go, Michael IK, 19th century fan. Yes, just answered your question. I think Christopher Plummer does very well as Wellington in that movie. But anyway, yeah. So as we said, to just set the scene a bit more for anyone who's just come in and what have you, there were very large Russian and Austrian armies mobilizing in the background. There was a Spanish-Portuguese army, which may or may not have invaded southern France. British troops were being sent back across the Atlantic from North America, where they'd been helping to stop the Americans trying to take over Canada. So prospects for Napoleon were not all that rosy, really. But he's marching his forces north, and his initial aim is to defeat the Prussians and the Anglo-Allied armies, hopefully separately, and then occupy Brussels. And if he could occupy Brussels, many of these Belgian soldiers had been his own soldiers, only like 18 months before. Would you say that was fair, guys?
Well, one thing worth mentioning is that Belgium didn't exist yet.
As a nation, but I mean, guys from the area of Belgium.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the key things is that this area was had been France for quite a while now. So it was one of the first territories that was actually annexed by the revolutionary government, I believe, before Napoleon had even come onto the stage. So this idea of France's natural borders and Belgium being sort of an extension of France was quite a widespread belief. So I mean, yeah, it would have helped to solidify this claim, presenting it as a fait accompli for one thing, but also, yeah, it would have given him additional sources of recruitment, and I believe even then the Liège economy was quite gun focused essentially. So the armaments industry in Liège was quite well established.
And also the Dutch. The Dutch for years have been the Batavian Republic, which was another one of these republics that the French set up all over the place, all over Italy and what have you. And so there were lots of Dutch soldiers, including quite a few in Wellington's army, who 18 months previously had actually been soldiers for Napoleon.
Yeah, my understanding though is that had been that sentiment had been somewhat quashed over the time of all the various wars and everything. But I may be wrong on that. But the Dutch stand by their king a lot more resolutely after the Batavian Republic is brought to an end.
Yeah,
certainly
later on, but as I say, in 1814 and in 1813. Quite a lot of the soldiers who were in Wellington's army in 1815 had actually been Napoleonic soldiers.
Yeah.
And obviously this is one reason why Wellington has an infamous army. But yeah, Furius, what's your thinking on this stuff?
Not a whole lot to add. I just agree with Rupert's sort of point there. It's one of those things where, that famous Austrian statement that, Italy's in a country, it's a geographical expression. And it's very much true of Belgium too. So we reference Belgium as a locality here, but, Belgium was actually, strangely enough, really established as a response to the Napoleonic Wars and, created as sort of a wedge between this French sphere and this sort of growing Prussian North German sphere. And obviously, as we know, as history's transpired in our timeline, as is, Belgium becomes this very interesting sort of almost like a fulcrum between the two countries, which sort of acts as almost like a wire trigger between an ambitious France or an ambitious Germany against each other. With obviously
I actually have a Belgian friend, and even today, Belgium is quite heavily divided between the French-speaking part and the Walloon-speaking part. So,
yeah. And of course, obviously, 100 years from this event, we're talking 1914, the existence of Belgium in that context would have, pretty profound consequences for European and world history as a whole. But like I said, the justification for Belgium actually arises almost from this period here, because as you've both mentioned, there was the support base for Napoleon and the revolutionary forces in the more francophone parts of Belgium, whereas that sentiment probably by this time might not have been shared in the more sort of Flemish parts. Certainly, maybe not to the same degree, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's reasonably fair. All right, let's unless you've got anything to add to that, Rupert.
No, I don't think so. I think we can probably move on. It's worth just highlighting quickly though what the actual objectives of Napoleon was, because in the case of the coalition, it's quite clear that they just want to remove Napoleon and get back on with the process of sorting out the peace, whatever it might take the form of. They didn't quite know fully at the time. But in the case of Napoleon, it sort of seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, if either of you know better, he was just basically trying to secure better negotiating terms for himself so that he could stay in power and potentially even just get the 1813 offer back.
I would agree with that presumption. Rupert,
Yeah, I mean, what else could he have been aiming for, to be honest? But I mean, I don't think it was going to happen. But yeah,
I believe it was floated, the idea that they could instead, rather than fighting aggressively and try to destroy the armies on the offense, that they could actually fight a defensive campaign instead and basically wage a guerrilla war. But I think for future France, it's definitely a good thing they didn't choose that option, because that would have been immensely more brutal for the French population.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even if Napoleon could have gotten the general French population to support him, and I do agree with Furius earlier in that I think Napoleon's power base was really the army rather than the civilians. I certainly by 1815, I think a lot of French civilians they'd lost sons and fathers and husbands and really had enough of it.
And one of the bigger problems earlier on is that the royalist opposition had been so fractured. But by the time you get to 1815, the opposition is actually incredibly robust now, and even looking ahead, further ahead, the opposition that forms sort of during this time and during the late Napoleonic era is actually strong enough that the government that replaces the Napoleonic government and is put back in charge by Louis XVIII is oftentimes weaker than the ultras, basically. At this time, it's essentially not the embers, but the formation of what would become the ultra royalists.
Just one thing I want to add on just briefly as well. I sort of touched on how Napoleon is sort of a bit reflective of people like Caesar and Alexander through history, and sort of a lot of the mistakes that creep into Napoleon's career from like the middle part and onwards is sort of a reflection of complacency and a little bit of ego. And probably that even drove his comeback in the 100 Days campaign. Is that also as well, the phrase that I used about, being unable to quit while you're ahead, it's obviously probably true in Napoleon than most people in history, is that he rejects the 1813 proposal. And I'm of the view, I mean, no one can ever get into another man's head, but there's a part of me that always thinks that Napoleon, once he lost the Battle of Leipzig and the Battle of the Nations and had the coalition bearing down on France, every fiber of his body would have been regretting not taking the 1913 peace offer. The 1813 peace offer. And I think, in part, a lot of his activity and a lot of his decisions from that point onwards are basically him trying to reclaim the 1813 offer, but it will never come to pass again. And, he's sort of like, he's trying to chase a shadow in this respect, but there's a part of him that obviously seems almost haunted by the prospect that, yes, I should have taken this treaty and I didn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, had he had any common sense, he would have taken it. I mean, to be honest, like, sorry, he just would have. I mean, exactly. Even if it was just on the basis of I'm going to wait 5 years and then see what I can do. It was like this idea that you can come back in March and by June you're going to start fighting. I
mean, I haven't done the mental calculus at all, so I don't particularly know. But if we're to calculate all of his battle losses from Leipzig onwards, so that includes his retreat into France and then the French campaign 1813, and then obviously Waterloo the year later. I mean, had he taken the treaty option in 1813, he probably could have easily saved the lives of anywhere from like 100 to 200,000 French soldiers. 100%. But instead, in these desperate gambles to try and get that offer back, he rolls the dice a couple of times, and to the grave disadvantage of the men who were sort of pressed into service to fight these desperate battles for Napoleon after Leipzig.
And again, to go back to the domestic politics angle a little bit, these are quite often his supporters. Like, his support base in the army is itself also further wiped out by all these decisions. So, I mean, potentially in an alternate in an alternate timeline or something, there could have been some kind of much more peaceful return if they could have forced through something like some form of democracy, which actually restores a lot of Napoleonic era political reforms. Maybe even political representatives, possibly even Napoleon himself being given some kind of more junior position within the state, and all sorts of options had he not just completely hollowed out his own support base. And that's before we even get to the Second White Terror, which is coming in the future.
He did. I believe he did. He made some lip service to democratic stuff in 1815, but it was lip service basically.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that obviously the restored Bourbons go down this path somewhat more, and his support base that would have helped to sort of throw around some of his weight in that kind of time period is then hollowed out by the fact that he tries to go for these these rolls of the dice, these desperate gambits to try and secure a more preeminent position for himself.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, also the French army's morale was quite brittle in 1815, you have to say. Like when they were fighting, they were doing, they were good. But as soon as they thought they weren't winning, they broke totally. And after, I mean, like we're getting well ahead of ourselves here, but after the Battle of Waterloo, when they did break, there was no chance of putting it back together again. None.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
All right, let's just briefly talk about the armies involved in the 100 Days campaign, and also, I suppose, for anyone in the chat who doesn't understand it, we'll briefly, I hope, cover like the things that Napoleon did and didn't do that slightly changed warfare, or actually quite hugely changed warfare in some respects. So let's look at the armies to start with. As I say, when you're looking at these armies, you have to realize there are hundreds of thousands of more men in the background coming from Russia and coming from Austria and possibly from Spain and Portugal. All right. But the armies that were immediately involved in the 100 Days campaign were the French army, obviously, the Army du Nord, which was the Army of the North. And that was something like 80,000 men, I think, would be fair to say. Would you agree, Furius?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sort of like the relative order of battle for Waterloo, Napoleon has a strength of somewhere between 75,000 men. But let's also not forget that he does detach that
30,000 under Grouchy. Yeah, absolutely.
Grouchy. So you're talking about a total strength, because I mean, doubtlessly the Army du Nord would have had a base strength, and when Napoleon mobilized from Paris, he I would presume have taken troops with him. So you'd say that the peak strength of the Army du Nord would have been somewhere in the order of 100,000 men, maybe like 105, 110,000.
Something like that.
If you're counting for all of the troops.
I think it's actually, well, at least according to Wikipedia, which I'm quickly glancing over as well, it's between 124 and 126,000 men.
There you go. Yeah.
No, that's actually a bit more than I thought it was, but fair enough. He also has a pretty strong cavalry arm. He's got over 15,000 cavalry, which is the most he's had since before 1812. That's a pretty strong cavalry arm, and he has a lot of guns. And of course, let's remember that Napoleon himself was an artillery officer, so he always had a lot of guns if he could possibly get them. And tended.
Sorry, Andrew, just for reference sake, in terms of artillery discrepancy, the coalition forces at Waterloo have about 160 guns, just shy of, and Napoleon has just over 250. He's got 252 guns, so he almost outnumbers Allied artillery 2-1.
Yep, absolutely right. His cavalry arm, I think, is also a bit stronger than the Allied armies. And when I say the Allied armies, I mean the Anglo-Dutch army, as it sometimes is described, and also Blucher's Prussians. And in addition to that, the French army is a unified army. The Prussian army is a unified army, but the Wellington's army is not. Wellington's army is an allied army. Something like a bit over a third of it is British. And on top of that, he also has several thousand King's German Legion troops who are extremely good. These are King's German Legion troops, mostly from Hanover, but they're actually an integral part of the British Army and are some of the best troops in Wellington's army. And then in addition to that, he has a load of Dutch troops who are of very variable quality. Some of them are good, or not bad at least. Some of them are bloody awful. And some of them, as I was saying earlier, had actually been fighting for Napoleon only like a year or so previously. He also has German troops in his army. And again, they vary from pretty good to like not very good. And again, some of those are Hanoverians. And don't forget, Hanover in those days was still a possession of the British king. So Hanover in Germany, that is.
Am I right in thinking that this is where the phrase Dutch courage comes from, actually? That the troops could only be sort of encouraged to fight, but if they were drunk?
I'm not sure if that's where it comes from, but it's certainly always been a something that people say. I'm not sure how true it is, to be honest.
Might be a myth or something, but just throwing that out there.
Yeah, gin was a big deal in Holland in like Marlborough's day, so like it might even go back to that for all I know. But yeah, and troops were given rum even in the First World War. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't take all that much notice of that. Wellington's army was 68,000 men. 25,000 of those were British, and about 6,000 were King's German Legion. As I say, these are German, mostly Hanoverian soldiers, but who are actually fighting in regiments that are an integral part of the British Army. So 31,000 of Wellington's army was British or King's German Legion, out of 68,000. The rest of them, he had about 17,000 guys from the Netherlands. He had 11,000 from Hanover, 6,000 from Brunswick, and about 3,000 from Nassau. And all of those forces, other than the British and King's German Legion, were very variable in quality.
Indeed, as was the nature of the decentralized German powers prior to a unification.
Yeah, I mean, Germany, as you were saying earlier about Italy, Furius, like Germany was a geographical expression in 1815 rather than a country. So
exactly, yeah. What is it? What is it? A culture and a language, not and a place, not a country. Something to that effect.
Yeah. Whereas, of course, Blucher's forces were actual Prussians, although again they varied. He had regular soldiers, but he also had quite a lot of landwehr regiments, which were, I suppose, the equivalent would be if you were American, something like the National Guard, or if you were British, you'd probably say they were even Territorial Army, that sort of thing.
I was going to say, even in the context of the American Revolutionary War, the difference between like the mainline regiments of the Continental Army, and then its militia forces. The Landwehr would have been an equivalent to the militia forces, although the Prussians, to my knowledge, did have the most rigorous active reserve of any continental power. So these men were militia, but they were also militia who basically went through like a reserve system of training. So they were sort of like semi-trained reserve, I suppose is a good way of putting it.
I believe some of that is just coming in now, though, because it was actually after the flipping of Prussia after the 1812 Russian campaign, where they kind of had this
system, because it was masterminded by Clausewitz and Scharnhorst, etc.
But they had like a kind of popular mobilization sort of thing happening, and there was a number of reforms, I believe that actually accompanied it, such that various groups that hadn't really been either allowed or encouraged to join the army prior were sort of welcomed with open arms, and a lot of them did join en masse. So one of the groups that actually does start becoming very important in the Prussian army is Jews, actually.
Yes, exactly.
Really? I didn't know that.
Because they were prohibited before 1809, if memory serves me correct.
Prohibited until 1809, did you say?
Yeah,
Yes, I
yeah,
think
well,
he did,
prior to 1809, yes.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit later than that, but yeah, that sounds about right. The right kind of timescale, anyway. Either way,
Yeah.
Prussia is adopting a new, much more sort of mass mobilization method of raising their army. But at this time, because it's still very early in the process, and there's a lot of patriotic fervor in the air among the Prussian people, it is actually a very well motivated force, as I understand it.
And many of these Prussian soldiers too were smarting from the defeat of 1809, and so many were very much had a desire, and particularly embodied by the figure of Blucher, were had a desire to sort of get one back at Napoleon and to not have him exist as this perpetual threat to Germany. Because you got to think Napoleon and the treaties imposed upon Prussia, the Treaty of Tilsit, basically sort of chopped Prussia into pieces essentially. So there was a strong. You might say a strong nationalistic angle or patriotic angle from the Prussian perspective to crush Napoleon if given the chance.
Very revanchist.
Yeah. I mean, look, there were German authors and poets and what have you around in that era who you can go and look at, who certainly the Napoleonic era was kind of I suppose the start of a German rather than Prussian nationalism. I don't know if that's fair, but something like that anyway.
At the very least, you'd call it a very significant stepping stone on that road.
Judge Caligula Bushman in the chat was saying that Dutch sailors in the Anglo-Dutch wars were known to be suicidally fearless. So the English claimed it was because of the gin. I'm not sure if that's true, to be honest with you. The Dutch were certainly known as being good sailors and hard fighters. I mean, one of the Napoleonic naval battles, which is neglected, and it shouldn't be, was Camperdown, which was won by a Scottish admiral. And that was one of the hardest fought victories that the Royal Navy had in the Napoleonic Wars, because the Dutch did fight extremely hard. So, yeah. But look, guys, we've got to be a little bit careful, because like I've already seen on this stream, that we could do a stream, and I'm quite happy to do so, on the War of 1812. We could do a stream on various aspects of the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, I'd be more than happy to do a stream series on the Peninsular War, for example. But this particular stream is going to be about Waterloo, and we're over an hour, and we haven't even gotten on to the battles before Waterloo, yeah.
And thus we must plead to the issue at hand, I suppose.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. So anyway, Napoleon's idea was to defeat his enemies in detail. He advanced to the north, and he actually did very, very well. Even Wellington said that he humbugged me. And Wellington had quite a lot of forces to the west of the Waterloo position who weren't able to join him at Waterloo, because Wellington realized that, obviously Napoleon's aim was going to be to try and take Brussels, but he had to defend all across that area of the line. But as also Furius pointed out earlier, Wellington and Blucher, who were in constant touch with each other, they each had officers on the staff from each other's army who could, interpret what was going on and also send messages and all this kind of stuff. They kept very close together. This, I suspect, was mostly Wellington, because Blucher was an extremely brave man and an extremely persistent man, but I wouldn't say he was the world's most brilliant general. On the other hand, his troops liked him. He was General Forwards, Forwards, guys. But he also believed he was, on occasions, he believed he was pregnant by an elephant or something like that. True story, by the way. He was a little bit mad, was Blucher. But anyway, anything to say on that, chaps?
Yes.
I do believe. Oh, sorry, go Rupert.
Just quickly, that not only were the Allies in close cooperation with one another, but a lot of the people that had actually flipped to Napoleon had not actually done so earnestly. So the Allies, and particularly the the Bourbon court, which I believe was in Brussels. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they were actually receiving constant information from spies within the Napoleonic command and within the Napoleonic government and administration apparatus. And so the Allies were quite well aware of what was actually going on.
Yeah, to some degree. I think Napoleon's maneuvers were a bit of a surprise to Wellington and Blucher. Napoleon did put himself into a very good position, insofar as you could be in a good position facing the two armies he was facing. Furius?
Yeah, indeed. Just one point about Blucher is that I do, from my reading on this, I do believe that Blucher was also a raging alcoholic as well, for that matter. But yeah, you're quite right that essentially the once Napoleon had an idea of the disposition of both Wellington and Blucher's forces, you can see even from his maneuvers, as has played out, in our history, he makes a point to try and wedge himself between Blucher's forces, which had obviously started to coalesce in and around Ligny, whereas Wellington was approaching Quatre, and immediately, I believe it's a detachment, because Ney, I believe, has control of his left wing, and it's a force under Kellerman, who was one of Napoleon's cavalry commanders, who basically manages to shadow and block Wellington, even pushing back from Quatre. Meanwhile, Napoleon controlling the center and Grouchy, who controlled the right corps, more or less fall upon Blucher and engage in the Battle of Ligny, and actually keeps them, for the time being, keeps these two forces separate, and actually succeeds in not just holding the British at bay, but actually pushes them back from Quatre Bras, whilst also not quite defeating the Prussians in detail, but actually inflicts upon them a pretty severe defeat at Ligny. And had Blucher not being able to sort of retreat his soldiers in good order would have been a catastrophe, or could have been a catastrophe in the order of, Ulsterdet, Jena, where they just get overrun. It doesn't actually happen, but the Prussians are still hurting after Ligny.
I don't totally agree with that, to be honest with you, Furious, but I'll try and give you my views on this.
Of course.
And then we'll ask Rupert. My view on this is that Blucher's forces were more concentrated than Wellington's, for assorted reasons.
Oh, I completely agree with you there. Yes.
Yeah, they were more concentrated than Wellington's. And obviously, Napoleon looks at Blucher's forces and he thinks, okay, I can beat those guys. And he sends off Ney and something like 35,000 men from his army to go and attack Wellington and push him out of Quatre Bras. But when this happens, Wellington doesn't even have 10,000 men at Quatre Bras.
Exactly. It's like a small vanguard of sorts. I think, is it under Picton, if memory serves me correct?
Even the Prince of Bloody Orange, God forgive. But yeah, so to get this show back on the road a bit and make some forward progress in our chat. To cut a long story short, Napoleon attacks Blucher at Ligny and defeats him. It was Napoleon's last victory. It was his last military victory. He defeats Blucher, even though Blucher has slightly more men than Napoleon does. It wasn't one of Napoleon's great victories. He didn't use any great tactical insights or anything like that. It was one of his what had become normal for Napoleon. Apart from in 1813, it had become normal for Napoleon from about 1811 that he would basically form a mass battery and go through the center of his enemies 9 times out of 10. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Furious. But apart from in 1813 when he changed a bit because he had to.
No. And that's like most exemplified in, say, Borodino, where there's just absolutely no maneuver, there's no finesse. It's just bodies of men being thrust into columns and sent forward with very little afterthought. So no, there's definitely a change from Napoleon, certainly from, say, 1810 onwards. I mean, he does display some quite interesting nous in the Peninsular War, certainly in the beginning of the Peninsular War, where they overrun the Spanish army quite swiftly. But there's definitely a phase of his career, certainly sort of, I'm thinking like 1810, 11, 12, and most exemplified in the Russia campaign, where sort of Napoleon demonstrates very little finesse.
Yeah,
so I agree
overpower the enemy with a big artillery battery and bash through his centre with a load of troops.
Battery, so to speak. Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Patriotic Archive in the chat is saying, remember, Blucher was 70 during this campaign. Yes, he was. But I also think that Furius is correct. He drank a lot. He was a very brave man, don't get me wrong, but I don't think he was a particularly great general. He was very persistent and very brave.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
I believe in German they had like a nickname. They used to call him like the mule or something, like because he was resolutely stubborn. He didn't have a lot of, say, battlefield finesse, but he was just a stubborn general who went by the numbers and won, through sheer determination.
He was also known as Marshal Vorwärts, forwards. So,
yes.
But I mean, he did have some good staff officers supporting him, like some quite famous German generals and military writers were on his staff. So he was not like totally alone by any means. And I think a lot of the good decisions that were made in this campaign were made by his staff officers.
Correct. Yeah.
So basically Napoleon gives the Prussians, as Wellington said, a damn good licking at Ligny. But instead of retreating back towards Prussia, they didn't. They retreated so they could try and stay in touch with Wellington's army. Would that be fair, guys?
Well, in some sense, evidently.
Indeed. And that comes back to sort of what we were talking about at the start of the stream, about how the two forces tried to stay within sort of, gunshot of each other. The Blucher wheels around at Ligny when he starts retreating. They retreat northwards rather than eastwards. And like you say, so they end up falling back roughly somewhere like adjacent to Wellington's position, which ends up being vital for the outcome of Waterloo itself.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, let's move on to Quatre. I'm sorry, guys. Look, you could do a whole stream on the Battle of Ligny. You could do a whole stream on the Battle of Quatre. This is a Waterloo stream, and we're only really talking about this because unless you understand this, you won't get what happened to Waterloo.
Correct.
As I said, Quatre Bras was a bit of a different battle because Wellington's forces were more dispersed than Blucher's. And initially, he only had about 10,000 soldiers anywhere near Quatre Bras, which was an important crossroads, which he needed to hold to try and stay in touch with Blucher's forces. And as we've already explained, Blucher and Wellington were cooperating very closely. They had officers from each other's army on each other's staffs. They were sending messengers back and forth and what have you. And so Wellington only has some forces at Quatre Bras. And as the day goes on, like more regiments march up. But ultimately, the French have at least 10 or 15,000 more men than Wellington can ever put there. And because Blucher loses at Ligny, Wellington, who manages mostly to hold on to that position, has to retreat. He's got no choice, otherwise he's going to be outflanked. Would you guys say that was reasonably fair?
Yeah, doubtless. But also, it's one of those things too that even though technically Wellington is forced to relinquish the position, he buys time, which is actually vital in terms of how the battlefield for Waterloo eventually shapes out, and also allows him to coalesce his forces, because as you say, they're sort of arriving almost in a trickle. Whereas, when Kellerman and Ney rock up to Quatre Bras, they basically have almost the full brunt of the force at their disposal immediately.
They've got most of a corps there, really.
I believe on Ney's wing that he had a corps of infantry and supported by 2 cavalry, were commanded by Kellerman, so they were almost all there at the same time.
Yeah, and Kellerman, as you already said, Marcus, is he was a very good Napoleonic cavalry general. Yeah, what do you guys think of this thing that I've seen pushed around quite a lot recently? That Ney was suffering from some sort of PTSD by the time of the Battle of Waterloo.
You go, Rupert, if you want.
I was just thinking it's possible, but I mean, there's also I'm also fascinated by the telling that Ney was actually sort of reluctantly brought along in a sense. So a version of first his apprehending of Napoleon that didn't quite go right. Perhaps his intentions fully were to arrest Napoleon, but when so many of his troops started defecting, he no longer had an army to follow through with it. So he kind of had to either save face or just save his own skin by pretending that it was something that he intended to do. And so, in some sense, from that view, he would be taken hostage for basically the whole campaign.
Yeah.
Look, I will come on to this in a bit, but I think Ney had at least 3 or possibly even 4 horses shot under him at Waterloo.
Yeah, I'm inclined to
and
agree.
Of course, he'd also been the great hero of the Russian war. Like, it was Ney who commanded the rear guard most of the time.
That's right.
The retreat from Moscow. So.
And you got to think of the retreating units, and you got to think it was the Poles who actually did distinguish themselves in the retreat from Russia, and the cavalry of what existed in Napoleon's cavalry on the retreat out of Russia back to Germany. They were the ones who were facing the brunt of the Cossacks. And I hate to use the term PTSD because I think it's one of those things that sort of pathologizes normal human.
It's much overused these days, for sure.
Exactly. But I think there's probably some degree of the fact that Ney had survived repeated degrees of trauma and anguish. You got to think, if you're a conscientious commander, if you're just losing your men left, right, and center, and you're losing them to wounds, to frostbite, to constant battle that is unrelenting, because let's face it, the more mobile elements of the Russian army and then the Cossacks that supported them just harried the dying remnants of the Grand Army out of Russia. And anyone who was engaging with that would have been sort of essentially haunted, for lack of a better word.
Well, I mean,
I think also that would have played on Ney as well, because Ney has a very distinguished career even prior to Russia of being a very brave and bold commander.
Well, he was known as the bravest of the brave in the French army, which would have been a big deal back then. And I mean, look, Napoleon jumped in his carriage about, I don't know, halfway through the retreat from Moscow and pissed off back to Paris. Ney didn't. Ney was in charge of the rear guard.
Yeah.
And also bearing in mind what those advanced elements of the Russian army, especially the Cossacks, actually looked like at that time, and how grisly that is on the ground to actually see what is happening to rear guards in this kind of environment. So, on the one hand, you can say at the macro scale, yeah, he's seeing a lot of men die, but also how they die has got to be really pretty grisly as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, as I said, I've heard all this stuff that Ney might have had PTSD at Waterloo. We'll come on to that in a bit when we start talking about the Battle of Waterloo itself, which is the main subject of the stream. I would just say Michael K, 19th century fan, is saying that Gneisenau was Blucher's chief of staff and Clausewitz was chief of staff of one of the Prussian corps. Yeah, exactly. These are extremely distinguished Prussian officers.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think you've got to look at these guys to some degree when you look at the Prussian army's performance at Waterloo, more perhaps than Blucher, although Blucher was very brave. He was a very brave old guy, but he was also a bit skedaddle,
Well, I mean, and to be fair, when you're at that kind of level, just staff officer work is quite important in itself. So if you can get a lot of big and very talented personalities to be on the same page and work together harmoniously, then that in itself is quite an important skill for a general at that level to have.
100%. I would also say another thing. I think it was Gneisenau didn't totally trust Wellington, whereas Blucher did. So I think that's important too. I think Gneisenau was inclined not to retreat in parallel with Wellington, but instead to go back on the Prussian lines of communication to the east. And I think Blücher turned around and said, no, I trust Wellington because he had a good relationship with him.
Reminds me a little bit of Eisenhower, maybe. Similar kind of dynamic. Where the guy at the top is actually the one that is sort of the diplomatic figure that's able to get everyone to work together, where sort of more talented commanders on a lower scale, in a battlefield scale, are overlooked for that role because they're just not appropriate for that level.
Yeah. Furius, your thoughts on that?
I don't really have anything to add. In terms of the retreat, though, for Blücher, nothing would have been really achieved had he just kept retreating eastwards, aside from the fact that Wellington would have had his flanks exposed. The only thing is, I don't really know the fundamentals of this. I can't really speak on with authority, but the only thing I could have imagined is that, potentially if Napoleon had the numbers and he had even more cavalry, perhaps Blücher and Wellington could have been caught in something of a like a double envelopment, but in the end Napoleon did have anywhere near enough troops to actually accomplish such a thing. So I don't know what more risks he may have had retreating north rather than east, but doubtlessly it required discipline for the Prussians to retreat in a certain direction, and Blücher and his officers make sure it happens. So that obviously, like I said, plays an important role as we get to Waterloo itself.
Yeah, I was going to say somebody asked about that in the chat. The risk of doing that potentially is that they could have been sort of outflanked and isolated. So had Napoleon been able to bring up a lot more troops and potentially hemmed in the Prussian and British forces from the east, then you could be looking at a much more catastrophic loss rather than if the Prussians had retreated eastwards and potentially doomed Wellington, but saved themselves.
Exactly.
I'm not sure they would have doomed Wellington, in all honesty, but
hypothetically, if they had a lot more troops or something like that. But
if they had a lot more troops, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, the French army, as it was a bit bigger than either Wellington or Blücher's army, but it wasn't bigger than both of them, and it was only a bit bigger than either of their armies. So. Napoleon didn't have enough men, basically.
Although he did have something like 66,000 troops in training, ready to kind of reinforce him somewhere down the line. But that never quite happened.
Later on, but I'm talking about the guys actually fighting, on the 16th. Ligny and Quatre are on the 16th of June. Wellington has to retreat from Quatre on the 17th of June because Blücher and the Prussians have fallen back. But Wellington apparently, he always claimed, like I looked at this Mont-Saint-Jean position, and it was a good position. And in a minute, I'll talk about Wellington as a tactical commander. But you guys do yourself. Anybody?
No. No, I'm good. Drink, if we want to move on.
Yeah. I don't think I have anything. I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. Look, I'm biased, of course. Look at my name on this stream. But my opinion is that Wellington was probably the greatest British general ever. The only guy who comes anywhere close to him is Marlborough. But Marlborough, in some respects, was more of a politician in some respects. And the art of war was a bit different in the very early 1700s than it was in the early 18th century. The early 19th century. Wellington's hallmarks as a general were, when he could, he chose a position that the enemy could not see. All right. A lot of people in the modern world, we're used to regarding things like air power, and some of us have played war games and all this kind of stuff, where you have this top-down view of what's going on. And of course, no general had that really prior to about, I don't know, the early 20th century. And Wellington's deal was wherever he could, if he was going to fight a defensive battle, he was going to fight it with like positions that were reverse slope or were on a hill that the enemy couldn't see from their position. And this is exactly what he did at Waterloo.
Yeah. One thing that I did wonder about. So coming from some of that perspective, you sort of wonder what the role of something like a hussar is, or the the lighter cavalry that don't really have as much of a battlefield role. And yeah, it's for this purpose of being able to actually scout and effectively see what's going on beyond the realms of eyesight of your actual army itself, the bulk of your army itself.
Screening of troops.
Yeah,
reconnaissance
exactly.
was absolutely a vital role of the light cavalry for sure. So anyway, Wellington falls back to this Mont-Saint-Jean position, and when Napoleon comes up to it eventually, and incidentally, he's very angry with Ney for not actually defeating Wellington at Quatre. I've seen a few people claim that Quatre was a French victory. No, it wasn't. Sorry. At best, it was an indecisive engagement. But Napoleon was very, very critical of Ney for not defeating Wellington there, because he had a lot more troops and a lot earlier as well. But anyway, Wellington manages to withdraw his troops back to the Mont-Saint-Jean position, and he's got more reinforcements coming out from the area around Brussels, etc. But he does have what Wellington correctly calls an infamous army. He's got about a third of a bit more than a third of the army is British, and the rest of it is a very big mixture of like good-ish and terrible. And so he has to integrate his army. He has to like kind of do what the Germans did in World War II on the Eastern Front and put British units in with some of these not very good Dutch and German units. Don't get me wrong, King's German Legion, great troops. Some of the Hanoverians were okay, not all of them. And the same goes for some of the Dutch troops. Some of them were brilliant. Actually, that's unfair. Some of them were okay. Some of them were bloody awful. And Wellington has to somehow mix his brigades together and his divisions together, so that there is like British and King's German Legion troops in the areas he needs them to be, because they're the only guys he can rely on. The other guys might run away, and sometimes do. This is why Wellington says he had an infamous army at Waterloo. He's not talking about his British troops, although, as I said earlier, he did have quite a lot of relatively inexperienced second battalions. But he's not talking about them. He's talking about the Allied contingents, who really did, apart from the King's German Legion, vary a lot. Would you guys say that was fair?
Yep.
Yeah, indeed. I wouldn't disagree.
So anyway, Wellington gets this position. And if you're Napoleon, or any of the French commanders, you come up to this Mont-Saint-Jean position. And it's been ruined, by the way, because the Belgians decided to build this awful thing called the Lion Mound, which completely changed the whole battlefield. And Wellington even said, yeah, they've ruined my battlefield. So going there today doesn't quite give you, and I've been there, by the way, it doesn't quite give you what Wellington and Napoleon could see at all. But basically, Napoleon couldn't see much of the British army. He could see some artillery batteries and a few troops who were maybe like a bit more forward on the high ground. And of course, it had been pissing down rain for the last 18 hours or whatever. So all of the ground was wet, which meant that Napoleon wasn't even able to begin his attack until, what was it, 11 or 12, something like that? Furious?
Yeah, exactly. And it's noted often that at the opening of the battle, on the start of the 16th, that Napoleon was already sort of say disenchanted and even a little bit negative, because one of the critical means by which one moves a great deal of artillery, particularly in the case of Napoleon's Grand Battery, which had a selection of smaller caliber guns and also some larger caliber guns, for more long distance and more destructive.
Napoleon loved his
artillery.
12-pounders, which were
Exactly.
heavy field guns in those days.
Correct, yeah. But to move them over sodden ground was difficult. And so having had that like 18 and 20 hours of rain between the events of Ligny and Quatre and then the onset of Waterloo really sort of disconcerted Napoleon from the onset, because the ability for him to move this artillery was such a crucial, in many ways you could almost call it a bit of a force equalizer, because Napoleon, if you combine the British and Prussian forces, was outnumbered. And, Napoleon's advantage in artillery was thought to be a decisive part of if he was to break
over 100 guns, yeah.
Exactly, over 100 guns. So, if he was to break one army or the other, it would be on the back of the artillery, which on this sodden Belgian ground, it was made almost impossible to do.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that he must have looked at this British position and thought, well, I can't see many of my enemy's troops, because it was like Wellington had placed most of his troops on a ridge and behind the ridge. And of course, Wellington famously got his soldiers to lie down before they were engaged. And probably Napoleon couldn't see much of the British army. So even when he gets this great big grand battery in place, and bear in mind, like artillery in those days, cannon were direct fire weapons. You had to be able to see what you were firing at. Yes, they did have howitzers, which could fire like up and over, but they were very much a minority of the cannon in a field army. And he couldn't see much of Wellington's army, to be honest. So if I'd have been Napoleon, and of course I don't pretend to be such a genius, but if you can't see much of your enemy army, what's your grand battery going to fire at? It's just generally going to be like blazing away, possibly not absolute targets, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, what I'll say is that I know there's much spoken about, Wellington actually sort of disguising a good deal of these troops behind ridges that were sort of natural to the landscape and the topography of Waterloo. And that, I think, was an important aspect of Wellington's generalship, obviously well displayed at Waterloo. And yeah, I wonder to what degree that actually did, in many ways, throw Napoleon off, not being able to actually witness the disposition of Wellington's army, in a complete sense. And then obviously, as we know, sort of throughout the course of the battle, a number of particularly infantry attacks are sort of sent against Wellington's forces and rebuffed, because these troops are well disguised. And to fight a defensive battle on a ridge is arguably one of the most advantageous places where an infantry force can find itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just going to try and find out the map I have of Waterloo, which was the best one I could find. And let's see if I've got the right one here. I think it's that one. Yeah, that's the one I wanted. The other thing that Wellington had done, and again he was quite well known for this, he had occupied the chateau of Hougomont, which was like a big, a bit more than a farmhouse, with grounds and walls and what have you. And the guys had fortified that. They broke loopholes in the walls. They put up planks on barrels and stuff so they could fire over the walls and this kind of stuff. He did the same thing with a much smaller farm at La Haye. Anything you guys want to say about that kind of stuff. And this was obviously to break up the French before they even got to his main line.
Yeah, exactly. Those 4 positions, particularly the one at Hougoumont, was improvised sort of, and was an act of genius. Like sometimes getting these forward positions that confer even a little bit of cover and a little bit of defensiveness, and then being able to sort of utilize, like you say, loopholes through the wall. Even utilizing, what you do, whether, I mean, I don't know in this time period if they were using sandbags, but like sandbags or just being able to put up piles of dirt around certain firing positions to just sort of make them more well structured. Even like a well built farmhouse or a villa that had stone walls in itself, sanctuary from gunfire.
It's going to protect you from musket fire at least. Yeah,
exactly. Like you're going to have to dedicate. The opposition has to dedicate artillery to actually try and knock those sort of. They have to invest in them to knock them down. So it in itself provides a defensive value, and you can see here, Papelotte on the right flank and Hougoumont on the left flank. Are basically these forward positions. You sort of see that line. That's you see Picton on the right, Alton in the center, and Cook on the left. The front line there. These positions are sort of forward of that. So Napoleon has to commit to overrunning these forward positions before he's even able to reach the British line as a whole,
which he can't see. Which he can't see. Really can't see. Yeah, absolutely correct. And Rupert, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's the morale effect for one thing as well, but because it's difficult to bypass them because otherwise you'll be getting shot in the side. So even if you have a force in there that's trying to sort of neutralize,
you can't bypass them. You have to take them first.
Well, I mean you could to some degree, but you'd be accepting a lot of losses, and you'd be also accepting that your attack is going to be a lot more brittle on the basis that your troops are probably not going to be very fond of the fact that they're going to be advancing into the lines, knowing that their flanks are going to be exposed. Basically, they can't rely on safety from everywhere except the front. It's actually the reverse. If you're just trying to bypass either of these points towards the center.
I tell you, Rupert, like troops won't, if they can avoid it, attack something where an enemy is like on your flanks and is then going to be in your rear. They just won't. It's an idiot. It's an idiot thing to do too. And of course, what actually happens is Napoleon opens the battle with an attack with first 1 and then 2 divisions on Hougoumont. On Wellington's right flank, which is the furthest forward, but also the strongest of the positions that he occupied in advance of his line.
I believe there's another bit of significance. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, like, I knew Hougoumont was desperately fought over. I didn't actually realize it was the opening move of the battle, though.
Yeah, there you go. It was the first French move was attacking Hougoumont. It was the furthest forward of Wellington's 3 advanced positions. And Napoleon's no idiot, obviously, as a military commander, and he says, "Yeah, all right, well, we need to take that for a start." And as far as I'm concerned, and you guys may or may not agree with me, I think Napoleon's strategy in the whole of the Battle of Waterloo was basically to defeat the British in the center and like go right through the middle of them. He didn't really attempt to do anything on the flanks.
I think one of the, if there's a couple of, so sorry, Rupert, I'll just be brief. I think the 2 things that Napoleon, or it's evident in Napoleon's moves throughout the entirety of the battle, is that 1, he is desperate to either sort of overrun the British positions before Blucher arrives. As you can see here in this image, it's Bülow who actually leads the Prussian vanguard that ends up attacking Plassenoir later in the day.
Much later in the day, yeah.
Indeed. But whether it's the advance of or the many attacks by D'Erlon's infantry corps, in the opening phases of the battle, and then later when sort of Ney desperately attacks with his cavalry, several times, followed by Kellerman, who I think charges a little bit later in the day. and then they eventually
we'll
commit
talk
the
about that
guard.
one. That's weird.
Yeah.
But
But the point I'm making is that these are just dice rolls to try and overrun the center, and they never end up, doing any, I mean, yes, they inflict casualties, but ultimately it's the French who suffer worse than the British in this sense. And there's almost a case of, because he's constricted by time, and you even listen to like several of Napoleon's quotes, he'll always say that there's always this sort of endless compromise between time, opportunity, men, losses, etc. Like these kind of things exist in sort of what would you say, not contradiction with each other, but like one will pull from the other as a priority, as a matter of priority. And essentially Wellington's presence, or his troops' presence rather, at Hougoumont prevent Napoleon, because you can see here on this battle map here, Napoleon's actually got some relatively strong forces available here on his left, but Hougoumont is just this so kind of like this fly in the ointment, as this sort of
he
spoke in the
also
wheel that
originally
he can't turn a flank, and because he can't turn the opposite flank. Sorry, ING, he can't turn the opposite flank because that's where the Prussians are. He can't actually flank around.
Although he doesn't know that at this stage. Let's be honest. He's got
true.
Grouchy following the Prussians and supposedly keeping them away from the British. But on the left flank, originally only one division was like sent against Hougoumont, but the corps commander on that side then brought in another division because the first one couldn't break through. And of course, also to let people understand, at Hougoumont, Wellington basically put the best of his guards companies in Hougoumont. And like they were guys who were going to fight to the damn end. They're some of his best troops. His
infantry elite, as it were.
Yeah. And at La Haye-Saint, which we'll talk about in a bit, he again put some of his best troops, like some of his King's German Legion, who, as I explained earlier, were an integral part of the British Army, who had fought in the Peninsular War, really, really good soldiers. But there was a different issue with those guys, which we'll come to when we come to it. But at Hougoumont, Wellington had enough troops that even two divisions of French attacking them never managed to capture the place. Some of them actually broke into it. Some of the French soldiers did actually manage to break in through the gates, but then a Colonel MacDonald, I think his name was, a Scottish officer of the guards, managed to shut the gate with his other men, and then they just shot or bayoneted the few Frenchmen who managed to get inside.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I didn't know that about Captain MacDonald, but yeah, exactly right. And it goes to show too that structures like this can be such a huge force multiplier. That, I mean, what would be the strength of the units that were in Hougoumont? ING?
There were. I think Wellington, if I remember correctly, he put in the light companies of the guards and maybe the grenadier companies of the guards. So there were maybe 8 companies at most.
Okay, so a company strength, and they're being attacked by basically an infantry corps,
two divisions,
more or less, two infantry divisions, right? Which probably to the French, to the loss of the French, they didn't attack concentrically, attacked sequentially, one after another. You'd imagine if they were actually able to attack Hougoumont in multiple directions, they probably could have overwhelmed them. But because these attacks are sequential, these 8 companies that are in Hougoumont can basically concentrate their fire at any given time, and so the French just aren't able to dislodge them as a result.
Well, they were also British guardsmen, and whilst I was a British infantry soldier, and the TikTok says the British Army caused the guards because of the metal things they put on their boots to make that noise when they march. TikTok. We like to take the piss a bit, but actually the guards are pretty brave dudes, and always have been as well. So, and well disciplined. So yeah, but anyway, this is how the Napoleonic attack starts. It doesn't go well. It gradually pulls in more and more French troops who Napoleon's not at Waterloo really controlling his army all that well, in my opinion. Why did he allow another division to get pulled into this attack on Hougoumont?
Indeed. I mean, the thing is, attacking Hougoumont made sense because the British had to be dislodged for the French to be able to make headway on their own left to attack Wellington's right. But I mean, as I sort of mentioned this before, you don't do it by sequential attacks by two different units of infantry. You try and attack concentrically and surround it from multiple directions. And the French just don't do this. And you almost get the idea that from around just before midday, you could even argue by mid-morning, this discipline is starting to break down the French army. And it's almost as if because there's this, well, you got to think there's a race against time tactically, because yes, that we don't know what the Prussians are. The Prussians will arrive at some point because, the British and the Prussians are both listening for the guns, and the French realize that, they are in each other's proximity for the sole purpose of supporting each other. Meanwhile,
I don't know, Furious. Do the French realize this? I don't think the French realized this until very late in the day.
Well, I think the fact that the Battle of Ligny is fought is indicative of the fact that Napoleon knew he had to prize them apart. That's why I say that. Just to finish my point, the second thing is there's a strategic clock that's ticking, as in the French know they have to defeat this coalition force to be ready for the Austrians and the Russians who are coming. And I think,
100%,
as happens often in military affairs, the moment there's a time pressure, even able commanders, even intelligent officers start making mistakes. And it's interesting that if you look here under on the left, the French left flank here, that attack occurs at 11:30 in the morning. That concentric attack on Hougoumont, they're already starting to make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's before midday where already they're making operational and tactical errors. And as the day goes on, the French grow in desperation. That's one thing I've always realized about Waterloo.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Rupert, your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I think it sounds like you pretty much covered everything that I would have said.
All right, so the next major French attack is d'Erlon's attack, absolutely in the center. This is classic later Napoleon, with his Grand Battery formed and it's bombarding away against the British, who it mostly can't see, but it's bombarding away and it is killing quite a lot of guys. The troops may have been behind the ridgeline and may have been lying down, but some of them are still getting killed. So then d'Erlon attacks with a couple of divisions, absolutely dead in the center.
Yeah, and all in column formation as well.
Yep,
because Napoleon loved the shock value of columns on the march.
Yeah, and he'd been told, incidentally, guys, by his marshals who had fought and been defeated by Wellington, that this doesn't go very well against the British Army, but he still did it. And so d'Erlon starts this massed attack with his drummers going rub-a-dum, dum-a-dum, rub-a-dum, dum-a-dum, and all this crap. And Wellington gets his forces ready, keeps them lying down, and they're going to stand up at the last minute, fire a couple of volleys at the French, and then bayonet charge them. And as happened in 90% of the battles in the Peninsular War, the French would probably retreat or run away. That's what happened in most of the battles. You will hear people saying, oh, yeah, no, the British could fire 3 shots a minute, which they probably could. They were very good professional soldiers. But most armies in the Napoleonic Wars did not stand there trading volleys at close range. What the British did in the Peninsular War generally was fire 1 volley or sometimes 2 and then launch a bayonet attack. And because the British were in a 2-deep line rather than a column, they outflanked the French column, and the French column, having had most of its first 2 ranks killed or wounded, would run away. Fair enough, Furious?
Yeah, fight than shock was an effective tactic. And this is the thing too, like Napoleon made a lot of headway using the column against, say, the Austrians and to some degree the Prussians. But because the British had a very good system of maximizing their firepower, I'm talking the level of the rifle, regiments and rifle companies, etc. And then not having any sort of compunction, not having any, how can I put this? The British were unafraid to utilize the bayonet charge. Is that they would outflank them whilst impacting on the French line. The bayonet charge, which itself is a shock factor for an army, and then being outflanked simultaneously. I mean, it would work to devastating effect, and it worked to devastating effect here as well at Waterloo.
But in fact, in this attack by d'Erlon, it didn't, because instead of that, the Union Brigade charges out, slightly outflanks d'Erlon's attack. The Union Brigade was so called because it was the Scots Greys and an English and an Irish heavy cavalry regiment. These are big dudes on big horses with big swords. Basically d'Erlon's lost a division and a half very quickly because they hit the flank of d'Erlon's forces and destroyed them. Then the British cavalry did their famous thing, which Wellington was always very critical of the British cavalry for doing. Instead of stopping and going back, they decided, okay, we're going to charge the French Grand Artillery Battery, and they did that, and they killed some of the gunners. And then, of course, they all got outflanked by quite a lot of French cavalry. Would you say that was fair, Jens?
Probably the one mistake that the British make at this point in the battle is overcommitting the cavalry too early. And I think given the success against Erlon, they'll sort of how can I say, taken away by the thrill of success. And of course, and this is the thing too, when you have an army that is has a distinct artillery advantage, if you're a cavalryman, your desire is to try and minimize that advantage your enemy has. So it's understandable why the British do this, but it ends up being sort of their certainly so far as the cavalry is concerned, it ends up being their undoing to an extent as well. They definitely overcommit trying to attack the artillery of the French.
This is also, of course, when Sergeant Ewart of the Scots Greys captures a French eagle, and you can read his account, which is extremely gruesome. He talks. Sergeant Ewart was a big dude. He was about 6'2", 6'3" tall, on a big, heavy war horse, and he talks about like his sword cutting a Frenchman's head in two, almost down to his teeth, and he had a pretty desperate battle, obviously, to capture the French eagle, but he did, and subsequently was commissioned as a second lieutenant as a result. Guys, give us your thoughts on this stuff.
I can't say I've actually heard the account myself, but it's definitely an insight into the fact that we often tend to see some elements of war historically as being sort of, maybe glamorous isn't the right word, but of dashing gentlemen on horseback with sabers, and it's all sort of civil and et cetera, but it's not that. War in all its context, whether we're talking about Alexander and his campaigns, or Caesar in Gaul, or whatever, or indeed we're talking about Wellington and Napoleon here at Waterloo. Warfare is ultimately a gruesome business. So when you see the account of an officer who cleaves a Frenchman's head in two to capture one of Napoleon's eagles, it certainly isn't for the faint-hearted to read about those kind of accounts. I mean, it's particularly grisly and gruesome in many ways. But that is just the reality of warfare.
100.
Well, there's that famous picture of the cuirassiers, cuirass, which paints a similar kind of story, where there's a cannonball that's sort of gone straight through it, and you can not only understand the impact of that and what that would do to a man, but I believe it's also been tracked down who was actually wearing the breastplate, and you get a little bit of his background to see sort of who he was before. Yeah, he just went into battle and never came back. So,
but to be fair, the French cuirasses were actually proofed against pistol and musket balls at certain ranges.
Not against cannonballs.
No, nothing was proof against a cannonball, of course.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
This is like a solid iron ball between 6 and 12 pounds. That thing would just go through you. Didn't matter. But they were proof against pistol balls, which officers carried, and some cavalry. And they were proof against musket balls at a certain range, like not probably like a 50 yards, but 100 yards, maybe, you know? So they did definitely give you an advantage, I suppose.
Yeah, I believe that was more or less true all the way up to World War One as well. I think they were the cuirasses were still reasonably effective. So when the cuirasses dismounted and went to the trenches,
today we're back into it.
Well, yeah, to a great extent.
Body armor.
When they went back into the trenches, they on off their horses, they still kept the cuirasses because they were still effective.
Absolutely, and of course the French cuirassiers fought in the 1870 war against Prussia, and indeed fought in the war in 1914. The only difference being they had a khaki cover on the front of their cuirass. So that's about the only difference, to be honest. But yeah, true. So yeah, I don't know. Look, so anyway, D'Erlon's attack, which is Napoleon's first central attack, goes totally wrong. Now, I'm not absolutely clear, and I'll direct this particularly to you, Furius, about what happens after this, because somehow Ney starts leading all these ridiculous, totally unsupported cavalry attacks against the British line.
Yeah, it's the great mystery of Waterloo, isn't it? Pardon me a second.
I mean, I have heard that like some Brits were repositioning, and Ney was told or assumed somehow they were retreating, although I don't know why. But I have heard that. But like the combined arms is the way warfare always goes. And like the idea of cavalry attacking on their own with no artillery or infantry support is like pretty moronic, particularly against well-drilled troops like the Brits, who would form square.
I was going to say, and against a defensive ridge as well, where the cavalry's momentum is impeded somewhat as well.
Oh yeah, and obviously, as we've already said, the ground was pretty muddy, so they're going up this slope. And then when they get over the slope, suddenly they find all these British infantry squares all over the place, already prepared to meet them. The artillery were firing until the last possible moment, and then were retreating into the infantry squares. The British infantry actually kind of liked it because it meant the French artillery had to stop firing. And the French artillery was killing quite a lot of them. Even though they couldn't really see where they were, just the amount of fire the French were putting at the British position was killing quite a lot of British soldiers, whereas the French cavalry were relatively harmless.
I mean, when I look at this sort of battle map, I mean, there's several of them about Waterloo, and I can't help but think, Ney's attacks begin at 1600 hours. You see secondary attacks there by Kellerman about an hour and a half later. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ney attacks the British line at least half a dozen times, always reforming this cavalry and goes again.
He has 3 or 4 horses shot under him.
Exactly, in the course of the day.
French cavalry attacks,
Exactly. And then there's one of the last moves that Napoleon makes at the center. I mean, I'm suppose we'll get here at some point, but the Imperial Guard are committed at 1900 hours. And when one takes into account the fact that Napoleon did have an artillery advantage, and that the Imperial Guard was located sort of to the center left of Napoleon's own battle line and thrown against Wellington's center right, had Ney's cavalry attacks coincided with the committing of the Imperial Guard, I mean, I dare say the French probably still would have lost, but it would have been a far more bitterly fought fight with, basically the cream of Napoleon's infantry fighting alongside Ney.
Napoleon was always very reluctant to use his Imperial Guard.
Oh, he was.
Always.
But the point is, he committed them far
They
too late.
weren't called the Immortals by the rest of the French army for nothing. It was partly because they didn't fight as often. You know?
although that being said, don't forget, if you look at the very bottom of this screen here, it's a little bit obstructed, but you can just see it. The Imperial Guard is split into two because they were committed by Labau. They were basically part of the reserve. Part of them are deployed right because they actually end up screening against Bülow's advance on plus.
Oh yeah, the young guard, the young guard,
young guard,
and maybe the middle guard were used.
Well,
against the Russians.
I believe the middle guard was split, so I think the young guard and half the middle guard was sent to counter Bülow. And as we both know, Plus and White changes hands several times in the course of the afternoon.
Yeah, it's a ding dong battle.
It's savage. It's actually it's a ding dong battle. It's savage. But I guess the point I'm making is that, you know, that Napoleon was happy, well, not happy, but he utilized the Imperial Guard as a matter of necessity to protect his right flank, especially after D'Erlon suffered his losses so early in the day. They had to protect the right-hand side of the line from the Prussians coming along. But that the other portion of particularly the old guard that were just uncommitted for the rest of the battle, you know, to commit them at 7 p.m. is just, it's too late to make a difference. The point I was basically trying to make is that if that Imperial Guard committal coincided with Ney's cavalry attacks, the French may still have lost, but it would have been a far more, potentially fatalist, a fatally compromising attack for the British line. It would be far more complicated for them to deal with, rather than just Ney charging in headlong half a dozen times with unsupported cavalry, and then at the end of the day, Napoleon commits the Imperial Guard that doesn't have any protection or any kind of screening forces, and then just pummeled with a combination of rifle fire and close range artillery. It ends up being a
look, we've got to explain for people in the chat here that infantry fights in the Napoleonic Wars, your smoothbore musket had a range at most, a useful range of about 150 yards. And really, if you were going to cause the enemy a lot of casualties, you wanted to fire up 100 yards or less. In fact, considerably less. But you needed to be in line to do that, because that was the way you could bring the most muskets to bear. And the French army in line was in 3 lines. The British army for years, like going back to the American War of Independence, had fought in a 2-rank line, which requires a bit more discipline, but actually gives you better firepower. And if you're going to receive cavalry as an infantry soldier in the Napoleonic Wars, you have to form square. Now, a square basically can't move. Like, it's just stuck where it is. But on the other hand,
it's a static formation.
Yeah, but cavalry are not going to break that square, except with extreme courage and absolutely a lot of luck. Like,
can I just come in
a couple of horses might. Let me just finish.
Okay.
Occasionally, a couple of horses might get shot and fly into the infantry square and break something, and maybe the cavalry could go through that way. But generally speaking, you cannot get horses to charge 4 ranks of dudes with fixed bayonets. You won't. The horses are not entirely stupid, you know. Mm-hmm. So basically, you end up riding around them and getting shot, which is what happened to most of the French cavalry at Waterloo.
Exactly.
Carry on, Furius. I beg your pardon.
Actually, funnily enough, you kind of you telegraphed my comment. You knew exactly what I was about to say when you mentioned about 4 ranks deep with bayonets. The only thing with a square is it needs to be sufficiently deep to have reliability of firepower when they're shooting at the cavalry, and also to provide depth in the instance that they are charged. Particularly, I would say that you'd want a minimum of 3 to 4 ranks of men in the square to give it depth, because if the square is too shallow, if it's only, say, a single or double rank, you know, if you have heavily armed cuirassiers, they can break a square if they commit everything to that charge. The other thing as well is that it isn't just, this unit will form a square. What they generally do is, and for instance, Napoleon did this to great effect at the Battle of the Pyramids, you know, when he was a young man back in the day, is if you have these squares that are located within proximity to each other, and they can provide crossfire against like angles of advance of enemy cavalry, And if you can get that crossfire, they will
everyone
mow
is
down horses.
Every battalion square is slightly offset.
Yep.
And your cavalry can only go between them being shot by everybody. And they can't charge. They really can't. And if they try, as you say, Furius, there's like 4 ranks of men. The first 2 of whom are using their bayonets. One lot of dudes with the butt of their musket on the ground. Another lot slightly higher. And two other ranks firing at them. You don't want to be a cavalryman in that position. You're probably going to die.
Mm-hmm. And if they're particularly well-drilled men, they'll cycle fire. So they'll fire by rank within the square to sort of provide a withering, enfilade of fire against the horses that are approaching their square.
Yeah, absolutely 100% right. But what you try and do as Napoleonic warfare was very much rock, paper, scissors. Cavalry could do certain things, but not others. Infantry could do certain things, but not others. Artillery could do certain things, but not others. And what you had to do was use them in coordination. So what you would try and do, if you were, say, Napoleon at Waterloo, is you would want your horse artillery to go forward with your cavalry, and an infantry battalion in square was very vulnerable to artillery. But this didn't happen at Waterloo. It didn't. There were 1 or 2 British regiments which lost something like 70% of their blokes, and you could see where their square was after the battle because that was where all the dead were. But that was not most of the army.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. The other thing I'll mention too is that because of the way the French tend to fight, certainly as Napoleon's career develops and he tends to sort of go towards this sort of shock column formation for infantry, particularly maneuvering within a given battlefield, is that the French tend to move and attack in greater numbers, whereas the British tend to fight in slightly smaller units, be it at the company level or regimental level, whatever, which means that as a formation, they're less prone to suffer artillery casualties. The thing is, and like, yes, the clumping a lot of men together gives that unit shock value and also gives you a firepower advantage if you can array those troops into, say, 3 or 4 lines of ranked fire. But the thing is, by having a large cluster of infantry, they're also a massive target for artillery, and they will suffer losses. And this is actually kind of where Napoleon's all or nothing approach does cost him, not just at Waterloo, but even at other battles, is that when you have these large shock columns of concentrated, putting several, companies and regiments together, if they're targeted by indirect fire or even executed musket fire, they will be mowed down. And this absolutely happens, firstly to Erlon, but also in part sort of even happens around Hougoumont as well, that these large clusters of infantry just become targets for concentrated fire.
Yeah, another thing I would say is that Wellington, generally in the Peninsula War and absolutely at Waterloo, forbade his artillery from engaging in counter battery fire. Wellington wanted his artillery to fire at the French infantry and the French cavalry.
He knew exactly what he was doing, and it worked.
Yeah. To my mind, Wellington was the tactical master of the Napoleonic battlefield. We have to talk a little bit about La Haye, which Wellington had garrisoned with the light companies of the King's German Legion. And this actually was their downfall in the end, because the King's German Legion light companies used the Baker rifle just like the Rifle Brigade did, and some of the 60th rifles. And they ran out of ammunition. And that was the only reason the French eventually captured the damn place. But by the time they did, it was pretty useless to the French because the Prussians were appearing on their flanks by this stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Germans resisted, let me say. Even when they ran out of ammunition, the King's German Legion, who were some of the best troops in the British Army, resisted with bayonets even when they ran out of ammunition. So You know, they were damn good soldiers.
Absolutely, yeah, and it goes to show you also the fighting sort of equality of men when they in that situation. You know, I know it's a little off topic, but if you'll give me just a second, it reminds me of that Foreign Legion contingent in Mexico, like when they're down to like the last 6 men and they refuse to surrender even though they're out of ammunition.
The guy with the
wooden,
what is it, wooden arm or wooden hand or something like that?
Yeah, it's still on display in a museum somewhere.
Yeah,
One of the officers in the Foreign Legion. Yeah, he had a wood prosthetic. Yeah, and
I know that story. Yeah, it's a pretty good
yeah.
story actually. Yeah,
and you just get moments like that. I mean, you and I have even spoken about North Africa and like the Italian paratroopers. The same thing. Like when you get well motivated troops who are disciplined and just have that fighting quality, even if they're out of ammunition, they'll find a way to fight on. And often that kind of desperate defense in whatever situation ends up being such a block for that opposing force that it sort of derails the enemy's best intentions. And actually, a good example of that is, well, this part of the world, but 100 years later, the so-called lost American battalion in the Argonne forest, and it sort of chokes up the entire German defense of that sector that ends up leading to the breakthrough in 1918. And this very much happens at this part of the battlefield where the German Legion digs in and resists the French right to the bitter end, even though they're out of ammunition, really does win the center for Wellington. And by that point, the Prussians are entering the battlefield in increasing strength. And there's really no point from here where Napoleon can feasibly win the Battle of Waterloo, which makes the committal of the Imperial Guard all the more perplexing. And it's a pity.
Well, it was his last chance. It was his last chance. It was his last chance. But I got nothing left, is what I would say. I would also just say, Furious, the Italian paratroopers were pretty good soldiers. Italian Bersaglieri were also pretty good soldiers. And I was lucky because I'm an old bastard. Like, I knew guys who fought in the World War II in North Africa. And before Montgomery arrived, were they Army soldiers then? I'm not sure, but I knew guys who didn't.
Yeah, because it would have been O'Connor and Auchinleck, and it was still the 8th Army. So yes,
yeah. The dude I knew was like he was an Auchinleck fan, and I think he was a sergeant in World War II in North Africa, and he always said Bersaglieri were pretty good Italian troops too. Like, you didn't attack them thinking, all right, we're going to win. No. So
exactly.
But the final attack of the Imperial Guard, Waterloo is kind of this weird battle that it's almost like a movie, And this is Napoleon's last chance. The Imperial Guard attack. This is why today, if you watch anything to do with Britain and you watch the Brigade of Guards, you'll see them wearing bearskins, and they wear those bearskins as in honor of defeating Napoleon's Imperial Guard, who wore bearskins. And this was the final act at Waterloo, really, almost the final act. They attacked. Wellington's troops were all positioned. They got slaughtered. The French Imperial Guard ran away, like, recall. And Wellington waved his hat and the whole British line advanced.
Yeah. I can't remember the phrase in French now, because whenever one watches a documentary about Waterloo, it's obviously referenced. But and I just can't remember the French vernacular at the moment, but the Imperial Guard basically cry out once their columns are broken. They basically sort of say, like, every man for himself. And apparently the Imperial Guard had never said this at any point in their fighting career, for the decades that they had existed. And once the Imperial Guard break in the face of, Cook's infantry here.
And Maitland, Napoleon, Wellington says, Maitland, now's your time.
Maitland,
Wellington was always perfect on his... Wellington was, in my opinion anyway, I think he was the best tactical commander in the Napoleonic Wars by quite a long way. He always was in the right place and knew exactly what to do. His troops didn't love him because he was strict as fuck, but they did trust him.
Yeah, and you said that at the start of the stream, and it's very true. And what's interesting here is if we just look at the disposition of the troops here, right? Because this is just like a snapshot of a particular point in time. It obviously has the times of the various attacks, but this is taken from a particular stage of the battle near the start of the battle, right? But if you look here, Wellington knows in approximate terms that the Prussians are to his west, to his east, which is his left side, and he's sort of counting on them arriving at some point or being in that area. And yeah, he's got that full position of Papelotte, and Picton is there on that left flank, which, as we know, Picton is actually one of the first casualties amongst his officers quite early in the battle.
If you go to I don't know if it's still true, Furious, but in the old days, when you went to the British National Army Museum in Chelsea, his top hat with the bullet hole in the front was one of the things you could see in
because he was dressed for that ball, and he went straight from the ball to the battlefield, didn't he?
Picton was great. He was a Welshman. Yeah. He's recently come under heavy attack from the left, of course. But he was actually a really good dude and extremely brave.
Yeah, and probably I'd say one of Wellington's best officers.
I mean, Daddy Hill was probably Wellington's best officer, I reckon. He was the one he trusted most, but Picton was well up there for sure.
I was going to say Picton would be close behind, yeah. But the observation I want to make about this battle is that knowing that Napoleon was approaching basically from his southwest, right? Look at where he places the Dutch. He's basically got the Dutch sort of floating as a screening force for his extreme right flank. And then here there's Clinton with a reserve. There's Cook. They've got the position of Hougoumont. His most exposed position is actually his most densely manned and densely defended, and he has the largest reserves there. And so Napoleon has no way of actually turning the extreme flank without basically stretching his line.
No, he's got to break his centre all the way through the battle. Napoleon has to break Wellington's centre. He never really stood much chance of doing that, to be honest.
Exactly, but more to the point, Napoleon can't even flank the Wellington's weak flank because Wellington knows that's where the Prussians will come. So Wellington, by his tactical deployment, essentially forces Napoleon to dice roll the center every time. And so I'm basically agreeing with you. Wellington's dispositions and deployments for Waterloo were perfect and almost faultless, given the troops he had at his disposal at the time.
Look, I think if Wellington had his Peninsular Army at Waterloo, the army he said he could go anywhere with and do anything with. Yeah. I think he might have been more aggressive. But given the army he was given, he just said, okay, well, you're not coming through my center. And that's what Napoleon tried to do.
Yeah. And also too, I saw someone in the comments early in the stream mention, like, what was the lingua franca of this polyglot army? That's exactly right. One of the best ways to keep an army that is, dare I say, multilingual together is to not attack in penny packets and to not be disjointed, but actually him holding a solid ridge line with, pretty close at hand reserves and not being too dispersed actually offered the best chances of keeping that army intact without miscommunications. I mean, you got to think Napoleon's army basically uniformly speak French, and they are attacking in a very disjointed manner from basically mid-morning onwards. They are making mistakes and errors despite being of a uniform language. Whereas
what would you say, Furious? The Battle of Waterloo was what, like 9, maybe 10 hours, I guess.
I mean, okay, we look here. This attack on Hougoumont is 11:30 in the morning. Bülow arrives in the
first one.
Exactly, and let's be even a little bit generous and just call it 11, just to give it a square figure. 11, because they obviously would have scouted it, you'd imagine, before attacking it. Bulow arrives at 1600. Ney attacks at the same time in the center, and the Imperial Guard are committed at 1900 hours, which is 7 p.m. So you could say probably by the time the French depart the battlefield en masse, you're talking a 9-hour battle. I mean, you got to think Plancenoit changes hands 6 times between 1600 and 1900 hours itself. You know, that's basically a chateau changing hands once every half an hour.
I think it's also worth mentioning that somewhere around 7 or 7:30, Wellington orders a general advance of his army. Because I'm not very happy with this idea that you often get these days. Oh, only the Prussians saved Wellington. Nah, I think Wellington had won his battle anyway. The only difference was the Prussians made sure that there was never going to be another one.
I mean, I see the merit in saying that. What I guess the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. That I think the proximity of the Prussians always was giving Napoleon something to think about, and this is obviously why Napoleon never. I mean, we can't know this as a fact, but my interpretation is that's why Napoleon never attempts a right-handed or eastward flank of Picton around the other side.
Furious, just suppose that Grouchy had done what Napoleon wanted him to do.
What he was meant to do.
Yeah, really push the Prussians and attack the Prussians. And let's say the Prussians don't actually arrive at Waterloo. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what doesn't happen has happened anyway, including Wellington ordering his troops to advance. Like, I mean, okay, so there's no Prussians, yeah? I don't think Napoleon has enough troops to anywhere near break through Wellington's center.
At the very least, I think we potentially end up with a draw, but a draw for Napoleon at Waterloo is a strategic loss. So yeah. I think ultimately we end up with a similar situation. I will say, though, I think once we see the appearance of the Prussians from the east, we see an increasing... I mean, there's always, like I mentioned, that attack on Hougoumont and that initial advance by d'Erlon, we see mistakes, right? But these mistakes aren't particularly fatal. It's the attacks by Ney and then the committing of the Imperial Guard, which are fatal errors by the French army. And what I will say, I'm not saying this to diminish Wellington at all. This is just an observation of French performance in the battle and Napoleon's performance in the battle, or particularly that of his commanding officers, is that as the Prussians trickle into the battlefield and contest Plancenoit with increasing intensity, we see a greater degree of error born out of desperation by the French. And I think for many people, that might be slightly over-exaggerated, but I think plays a profound influence as to people's judgment of Waterloo. I think they're right to make that judgment, but I think sometimes it's like overweighed to the extent that it deprives Wellington of his glory. Does that make sense? I think that's probably what happens. That's just me judging it, but I think that might be an explanation for it.
I kind of see what you're saying, but I also think, how on earth do you have like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, maybe even more of unsupported French cavalry attacks? What was Napoleon doing in that time?
Yeah, I dare say there's the point that we raised about Ney earlier, I think does actually merit discussion, particularly in regards to the outcome of Waterloo itself. From the first time I ever read this as a maybe not a boy, but as a teenager, I was always perplexed by what Ney was trying to do, and to this day, I still can't make sense of it. And more when I sort of, as much as I hate the pathologizing of the choice of men throughout the course of history, putting that very politely, but you know what I mean from an ideological angle, Iron Duke. In Ney's case, I actually think that question's worth asking, because it certainly doesn't seem sane. It certainly doesn't seem tactically sensible. And, anyone could see, even with a basic grasp of military history or, tactics, just sending wave after wave of cavalry into infantry squares in this style of warfare.
And the British infantry
mindless.
saying, "Thank God the cavalry are back and the artillery has to stop," because the French artillery had to stop because they would hit their own cavalry soldiers. You know,
Yeah.
I know the other thing that makes me think about this is like Mrs. Ney wrote several quite affecting letters to Wellington to try and get Ney saved from the French Bourbon firing squad, and I think Wellington, had he been able to, probably would have saved Ney, but he couldn't, because how do you save this dude who says to the French king, "Oh yeah, I'll bring him back in an iron cage, but actually I'm going to be his #1 general."
Yeah.
And I do feel sorry for Mrs. Ney, and I feel sorry for Ney because, look, just on the basis that Ney was absolutely a brave and good soldier, but he was an idiot, man. I'm sorry, he just was.
I'll have to say, just on this sort of little tangent I've been going about in terms of French desperation, I wonder if there's a small part of Ney's psychology that realized once the Prussians appeared over the hill, and maybe realizing in his own mind that Napoleon was going to lose, and Ney was probably the first of his marshals to have his head on the, proverbial chopping block, that he would rather die on the battlefield, and essentially, no matter how hard he tried, that stray musket, bullet just didn't find him.
Would have been better for him, rather than the crappy firing squad from the Bourbons that he got in the end. Yeah, no, I don't disagree.
Exactly. I run as a part of Ney that probably felt that, and just no matter how many times he charged, he just didn't find that, that stray thing, that, the stray bullet or, cannonball that just missed him. As you say, there's that famous one in that museum of that French cuirassier that has that hole blown through his chest where the cannonball goes through.
There are a few,
yeah. Ney didn't find his,
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. Rupert, you haven't said anything for ages, mate. Your thoughts on all of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to add on the battle itself. I'm just sitting and and enjoying the back and forth, to be honest.
All right. Was there a chance? I'll ask you this, Rupert, because this is your deal. Was there a chance that Napoleon could have turned things around after Waterloo?
No, not really. I mean, as we've sort of constantly said, as we sort of alluded to at the very start, the whole thing was kind of a time game. So not only did he have to win every engagement, but he had to win them all quickly as well. So when he'd not won Waterloo sufficiently quickly, then that was already probably game over. Never mind if he'd actually just managed to clinch it at the end. So, I mean, you mentioned a lot about the finally committing the Imperial Guard, and that has quite a lot of implications in itself. So one of the things about his Elba escape was that he was allowed to take a number of the Guard with him.
Yep.
And that's kind of partly how he was able to come back and actually have some base of support rather than just, well, it's not much, but it's something. And so there's almost like a I would also go sort of. I would also make a point basically about the final committing of the Guard, especially the old Guard, is that they have quite a lot of political reason for existing and sort of being as they are, because they're a very reliable, very loyal honor guard that you can always use you can always fall back on if he's in any kind of political trouble. And so the committing of them is really the eradication of any and the damaging of his own sort of like domestic political position. And then when they're eventually sort of isolated and basically destroyed, that's quite symbolic and domestically politically impactful as well, because he's got really nothing to fall back on.
Is it worth saying that as the Imperial Guard were torn to ribbons on the battlefield of Waterloo, as were Napoleon's political prospects in France? Well,
yes, exactly. And not only does that have sort of material implications for his actual base of support and some of his most loyal supporters, but it's also very symbolic as well. So his most diehard followers are all just sort of blown apart on the battlefield without really being able to do much.
Yeah. No, point well taken, Rupert. I'm bound to agree with you as well.
So not only is there sort of no hope of him being able to rescue the situation politically, militarily, but politically he's lost a lot of his base of support. The entire project in the first place was quite brittle, and so once it got smashed, then piecing it together was always going to be a difficult prospect. Basically impossible. So yeah, all that's left at that point really is to surrender. After that.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, because we reflected on this near the start of the stream, that Napoleon's prospects of reclaiming power and staying there were going to be slim anyway. Like, even Napoleon would have to thread the needle in every engagement with every strategic, tactical, and political decision in order to come out on top, which, I'm not saying I don't wish to say that it was impossible, but it was extremely, 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 extremely unlikely, even in the event that he prevails at Waterloo and defeats the British and the Prussians, because then he has to reckon with the Austrians and the Russians anyway. And how he fares against them, we will never know. But essentially everything had to go right perfectly for him to have a semblance of a chance. There's absolutely no way that can exist in the event of an outcome such as being defeated at Waterloo by Wellington and Blucher.
The only other thing, and it's probably more relevant because it's in his recent past, it's something that he was very aware of, is if he'd been able to enjoy something like the fortune of Frederick the Great. So one of the opposing emperors dies and is replaced by an absolute Francophile who's willing to sort of brush everything under the rug and make peace immediately. And then at that point, the prospects of his victory are significantly improved.
But then again, you're relying on the absolute dumb luck of Providence, right? Like it's out of his hand originally, in that sense.
And also let's remember that, basically the only reason that Napoleon was not executed after Waterloo was that the British didn't want to execute him. So they sent him to what anyone else who was such an enormous mass murderer would have regarded as a very, very fine prison, which was like a nice manor house on St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, which has a pretty nice subtropical climate, and like miles and miles you can go riding around and all the rest of it. He wasn't exactly put in a prison, And there were other nations, including the French, the Bourbons, of course, who would have happily executed him. Only reason he wasn't, because the British didn't want it. And indeed, it was to HMS, oh God, I can't remember the name of the ship now. It was to a Royal Navy battleship that he surrendered in the end.
I can't help but think when I sort of consider Napoleon's fate in St. Helena, there's that Napoleonic quote that sort of discusses fate, and it's just that I can't remember the exact words. I could be mincing it a little bit, but that for great men to live without glory is to die every day. And I can't help that, even though his retirement was somewhat comfortable, at St. Helena,
it was pretty comfortable, yeah.
That for a man who strived such glory, to be essentially the son of a Corsican rebel against France, to be a lowly artillery officer who becomes the star of the French directorate, to then become first consul and then emperor of France in a very startling career that probably in some ways even exceeded Caesar to some extent. To be this sort of chubby, tired, spiritually just bereft man that's just exhausted from years of power and bloodshed, to then just be isolated on this island.
Would you have sooner he was executed, Furius? Do you reckon it would have been better if we executed him?
I don't think it's a case of. I don't think it's a case of being better or worse. I just think there's a small part of Napoleon that his life ambitions were forever snuffed out. And I mean, we can put down his death to cancer or whatever it was, but he was pulled. He was, he lost his position in the world. He was unhorsed, you might say, from his own greatness, and as per his quote, to live without glory is to die a little bit every day, and that's probably
And how many men?
Ultimately,
How
happened
many
to him.
men did he kill, Furius?
Oh, goodness knows. It would have to be, if not the
hundreds of thousands.
if not the hundreds of thousands, definitely would have touched the millions. Like, he was a man responsible for widespread death and destruction.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like, given I'm a guy who thinks, like, if you murder someone, you should probably pay for that with your life, unless in exceptional circumstances. I don't know. I mean, Britain didn't kill him, but Austria would have done, Russia would have done, the French Bourbons certainly would have done. The only reason he wasn't executed after Waterloo was the Brits.
Yeah, had he stayed in France, I dare say he would have faced the same fate as Ney, if not a worse one.
And I think Ney was more unfortunate because, like, Ney was not the guy in charge. And he was a brave soldier, whatever you say about anything else about Ney.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was, like, the French said he was the bravest of the brave, and I think he probably was. I felt sorry for Ney, and I think Wellington would have saved Ney if he could have done, but I don't think he was able to.
Indeed. It's almost as if Napoleon sort of secured his fate by actually surrendering to the enemy. It's almost as if Ney made the mistake of not doing that, if you get my drift.
Yep. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, Ney should have just... when he didn't capture Napoleon, he should have just said, right, I had enough of this. I'm gone. In my opinion, but yeah. But going over to Napoleon again, that sealed his fate pretty much.
Well, certainly within France.
Like I said, the in the wake of the sort of mass betrayal of all the people in the government who had previously committed themselves to the restored Louis XVIII, that had some pretty significant implications for people like Ney. And obviously at the start it was backed up by the full weight of the legal system, but eventually Louis XVIII himself stepped in and actually stopped the killings, both judicial and extrajudicial, trying to hunt out anybody who was like a crypto Bonapartist or a crypto Republican, or all those guys.
There's a good film, guys, I would suggest people watch, which I'm sure both of you know, called The Duelists, which is actually a well worth watching film about the French army in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And the end of it in particular is quite relevant to what we've been talking about, I think.
One other thing, though, I do think there is an element, though, where, as I said earlier, once Napoleon had actually been recognized as an emperor by, I believe it was Alexander I of Russia,
but he never called him brother, did he?
I don't know about that, but during the opening stages of the, I can't remember when exactly it was, but he was actually during the proceedings of the Congress of Vienna, he was referred to officially as an emperor, or treated as an emperor.
I know it tells it Alexander kind of like did a bromance with Napoleon.
Yeah.
But that
and I think he stayed.
That didn't last for very long.
No, but he did stay reasonably fond of them afterwards, and he did adopt, especially at the start of the Congress, he was adopting more of a conciliatory approach most of the time. So rather than being much more in the mood of retribution.
Fair enough.
And that's also important because he was actually representing himself. But at this point, obviously, they really don't want to be setting the precedent of, it's okay it's okay to execute emperors when we do it. They were very conscious to not send that kind of message.
Yeah,
good point.
Yeah, true. Furious, your thoughts on that?
No, I have nothing more to add. I think Rupert hit the nail on the head. But what, just as an interesting observation about not wanting to create the priest executing emperors, right, is how in sort of 1848, just what you would say 35, 40 years after the events of Waterloo, There's this sort of great upset in Europe whereby the kings and emperors of the European powers are sort of given their real first shock that follows the French Revolution and sort of the political inertia that's released as a result of the Revolutionary Wars, and how maybe to some degree they're relieved that they did not create that precedent. I can't help but think that influence kind of sits there decades later.
Yeah.
Well, there is that, but at that point, it's kind of the next stage on a process that had been ongoing for a little while. So in
Correct.
in 1830, there's obviously that first revolution in France that overthrows the Bourbons. Well, not the Bourbons completely, because the Orleanists take over, Louis Philippe, and funnily enough, Russia is one of the main holdouts that refuses to recognize Louis Philippe, and I believe consistently refers to him officially as the Duke of Orleans or something like that. They don't actually call him. They refuse to call him king.
Fair enough. I'm going to agree with Lady Charlotte in the chat. She's talking about The Duelist, which is actually, I think, a very excellent film. Go and watch that. Waterloo is a good film, although there are many historical errors in it. And she's also, Lady Charlotte is also talking about Barry Lyndon, which is another great film. And of course, at the time, the director of Barry Lyndon wanted to do a movie on Napoleon. I'm not sure how easily you can do a movie on Napoleon. I think you'd probably need to do at least 3, but I don't know what you think.
I was going to say, if you read the works by Robert Asprey, which I do recommend, they're very excellent read. He breaks his books into 2 parts: The Rise of Napoleon, The Fall of Napoleon. And I don't think you could do Napoleon in any less than 2 parts to do it justice. It'd probably have to be like part 1, part 2 of the first half, and then part 1, part 2 of the second half, because so much happens in his life. It is so hard to encapsulate in a movie. And if anyone does a movie about Napoleon, take, for instance, Rod Steiger's portrayal of him in the Waterloo movie.
Yep.
And I believe there's a new one being released with Joaquin Phoenix that's due to come out soon. They will only portray a segment of his life because it is simply impossible to do justice to this entire arc of a man's history that is just so packed full of events and just
it would be like trying to do a biography of Wellington. You could not easily do it because it would be so long and have so many aspects. Totally agree.
Exactly, which is why the movies that they've made about Alexander, for instance, feel empty, because you just can't encapsulate the great career of a man and the great life or the life of a great man in such a short span of time. It just simply cannot be done with justice,
Well, we don't even have a Caesar movie, really, do we? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I like Rome, the TV series,
the HBO series, yeah,
the HBO series. It's still my favorite TV series ever, but it's not totally right, and they miss out important characters. So I mean, I love it. It's very very good. Go and watch it, but it's not accurate.
And just on the argument of in terms of portraying things accurately, like the interesting thing about watching those 2 series back to back is that the first series of Rome, which sort of targets sort of Caesar post-Gaul, basically covers a 5-year time period, right? Which spread over the number of episodes is fine.
Yeah.
But
season
then,
2, they knew it was going to be cancelled, so
they
were spreading things all over the place.
Correct, and you've basically got this period from Caesar's assassination all the way to Octavian becoming Augustus and the Emperor, which is sort of more like a 15-year time span, which you can sense that it's rushed. And the problem is when trying to cover a great man, be it Alexander or Caesar, or for example, a Genghis Khan, or I'm just trying to think of someone more, even a Richard the Lionheart, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Or a Napoleon. And this would probably be true of, say, Frederick the Great as well. You just can't compress it to such a short space of time. Just too much happens to be able to do it justice. It has to be done very properly.
Would you be up, Furius, for doing a stream series on Julius Caesar?
See, this is my weak spot, Iron Duke. I could never say no to a stream about Caesar.
No, look,
answer.
I'm a huge fan of Julius Caesar. Like, I don't.
Oh,
like
I'd love to.
I don't like that. The you know, the dude who wrote the book Rubicon.
Tom Holland.
I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like him because he doesn't like Caesar. I think Caesar was Rome's best bet.
Most egalitarians and liberals don't like Caesar for obvious reasons, you know.
Yeah, because he was a Caesar figure. But to my way of thinking, like, Caesar was the guy who gave average Romans their best bet, you know.
Absolutely.
He was obviously a popularis, but he was also from the absolute top end of the Roman aristocracy. But he was popular with ordinary Romans because he tried to do good stuff for them, like, you know, land reform and giving his legions like farms and all this kind of stuff.
And land, all of that. Yeah.
But if you're up for doing like a 2 or 3 stream series on Julius Caesar, I'd be up for that 100% because my knowledge is quite deep, but it's not very wide. I'm very good on the British, and my only other thing I'm very good on is kind of like Roman and Greek history.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. It'd be a pleasure. Like, seriously, as an actual, I mean, as you know, I love my classics anyway. I'm very much a fan of, you know, Greek and Roman and Byzantine history. That's sort of my bread and butter. These other things, like the Polyionicals, are just like an ancillary sort of add-on, right? That I happen to like on the side. But I mean, Caesar as a subject within itself is one of my favorite historical topics. So even if I wanted to refuse you, Iron Duke, I couldn't.
No, I just think Caesar was a good guy, which is why most ordinary Romans loved him to death.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
why his assassins came totally unstuck.
Yeah, and also as well, like you say about Tom Holland, you know, the author of the book Rubicon, and a number of people who write about him today, you know, dislike him is because they actually are fearful of not Caesar himself, but a Caesar-like figure that threatens how they perceive the world. And that in itself is telling, in my perspective, you know.
The other thing I like about Caesar, because I'm into military history, is like he had this plan to go into Parthia, but he had this plan to fight against the Parthians with things like ballistas and, you know, he was going to take the right weapons there to beat them.
He wasn't going to suffer the fate of Crassus, exactly.
No chance. No. And of course, Crassus is the great guy who was missed in the Rome TV series.
Exactly. Yeah, he dies just before like the events transpire as they do. And it's actually a pity they don't even mention him. It's kind of almost a bit crazy. But the one thing I will say is that, because obviously we're talking about Napoleon, is that often you sort of see names like Alexander, you know, often as people like Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, that sort of mention that same breadth of great generals. And there's no doubt that Napoleon, in terms of the numbers of victories, did achieve the greatest number of victories, you know, on a battle by battle basis. But definitely, you know, people will sort of see Caesar as more of like a political figure or whatever, and not give him his sort of dues as a general, as a leader, which is something I attempt to correct on public record, because I think he doesn't get nearly the respect he deserves as a general and as a military leader. But there's doubt that the one person who attempts to emulate Caesar in history is most definitely Napoleon.
Michael K, 19th century fan in the chat, says Caesar is probably taking a hit with the charge he committed genocide against the Gauls. Genocide is a charge that gets thrown around all the time these days. Did Caesar kill 1 million Gauls? Probably not. I reckon most ancient historians exaggerate numbers all the time. But yeah, you know, genocide is this thing that gets chucked around all the time. Since 1945, strange to say. I watched a thing on Twitter earlier today where there was a picture of Hitler and Mussolini, and someone said, these two men killed millions. Well, in Hitler's case, that's probably true. But Mussolini, like in terms of like murdering people, hardly killed anyone, actually.
Well, I mean, comparatively, absolutely.
I mean, he didn't. He was not a mass murderer. And in fact, while he still controlled Italy up until late 1943, even Italian Jews were under no great threat from anyone.
Well, exactly. There was no sort of like... I mean, I believe there were punitive laws passed when Italy entered the Pact of Steel in 1940, but they weren't...
Yeah, they were, but they weren't murdered.
Yeah, they weren't murdered. They even, I believe, weren't even apprehended, really, for the most part.
No.
They were left to sort of go about their daily lives.
Yeah, I think weren't really allowed in government anymore.
Yeah, which was a different situation to to the Reich, for instance. But
the
funny thing is, just
1943, Italy was basically controlled by the Germans.
The Germans occupied Italy in September, October 43. But the one point I want to make is, like, how often there's a tweet that lies and then there's a refutation that's true. Someone uploaded a photo, I believe it was of Trotsky, Genry Kigoda, and Lazar Kaganovich. It's like, these men actually killed millions of people. It's like, yes, that's the correction that Twitter needed.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Mussolini did not kill many Italians, even if they didn't like him. He killed a few for sure, but like, you're talking about handfuls, not even thousands.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, we are diverting a long way from the number
from Waterloo. Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway,
absolutely.
Yes.
But yeah, anyway, thank you very much, gents, for joining me. Final thoughts, guys, and anything you would like to shill. Starting with you, Rupert. Final thoughts and anything you would like to shill. Go for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully we've brought across the idea that there really was not that much gain to be had for either Napoleon or France for the whole escapade. The chances of anything positive coming out for either, again, Napoleon or France, even worse so for France, were incredibly slim. There's almost no scenario where Napoleon comes out better. So yeah, basically just tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives lost for basically nothing. Just Napoleon's hubris, more or less. But still,
an ego,
yeah, pretty much. But what it did eventually mean is that it sort of ushered in the second White Terror and ensured that the government and the environment, the political environment in France after the 100 days was significantly more hostile towards moderates and liberals, like revolutionaries, or sympathetic to the revolutionary ideals than it would have been otherwise, and than it was in the original Bourbon Restoration, because after the Bourbons, after Louis XVIII was returned again for the second time, he didn't really have that much power to stop the ultra royalists from carrying out the second White Terror. And all the various other groups. It wasn't just the ultra royalists. It was, a lot of people were very outraged at the fact that so many people had basically rallied back to Napoleon again, even though he'd been driven out and forced to be exiled the first time and brought nothing but suffering on France in his return. So,
hence Ney being executed, etc.
Yeah. I mean, Ney's execution is highly symbolic, but a lot more of the same kind of thing was happening all over the place, up and down the country.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. Anything you would like to plug, Rupert?
The only thing that comes to mind is I've recently had an article published in the Dissident Review. The second issue of that has come out, so you can grab that on Amazon and read my article, "The Tragedy of the Frontier." Right? It's called, as I recall.
Rupert, can you DM that to me on the Discord, and then I'll stick it in the description later on.
Yeah, will do.
Thank you very much. Furius, last thoughts and anything you wanted to plug?
Last thoughts, just because we've touched on Ney once again. There's sort of like an interesting, how they say that, history doesn't often repeat itself, but it very often rhymes, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Is that, Ney sort of suffers a sort of similar fate to a man who would follow him by 130 years or so, and that's the fate of General Pétain, the leader of Vichy France, in that
Fair
you
enough.
know
Yeah.
a man who has much placed on shoulders, and he's sort of essentially scapegoated and put before the firing squad. I mean, obviously the circumstances are somewhat different. But, Pétain was this lion of France who defended Verdun from the Germans in 1914.
It's almost the same line, Furious. It's like, France lost its way when they beheaded their king, and later on shamefully beheaded his queen, who was shit scared but still did what she had to do. In some ways, I just see Pétain as a carrying on from that.
Yeah, and you got to think in the midst of defeat in 1940. I mean, where was everyone else? Where was Gamelin? Where was I mean, I know we all know that de Gaulle obviously, became the ostensible leader of the Free French, and cuddled up to the British, and kept that cause going as per the French fighting in absentia. But in terms of the French who reside in France and who were going to live under some kind of Axis occupation, Pétain was the only person who actually recognized he had something resembling a duty, to have the French people governed, right, and to take on that mantle.
Furious, we also have to recognize that the post-war idea of the French resistance, in air quotes, most of the French resistance was communist.
Exactly. Yeah.
Insofar as there was a French resistance, which was not that big anyway. But yeah, fair enough.
But I was going to say, you're a man of sufficient age like me who will know the reference. But it's much as it's almost a case of that. That British comedy from the 80s. Allo Allo has blown out of proportion.
Love that show.
It's a fantastic show. And if any of you Zoomers who have never heard of it, go watch it. It's actually fantastic. It's good fun.
There's a chick who wears a French maid's outfit in it. She's very cute. Yeah.
Exactly. And well, I just want to say that there's this intriguing kind of link between Pétain and Ney that isn't often explored, but it's one that always sort of occasionally drifts into my head, because I can't help but think that men who have these enormous responsibilities thrown on their shoulders end up being executed by men far less worthy than them. I find is an interesting commonality that sort of happens to brush itself up in French history every so often. But I'll leave that there. We've had a very thorough 3-hour conversation about Waterloo, so I'll end it there. But that was my final thought, because it was on my mind.
I think Ney was a better man than Napoleon.
Oh, absolutely.
But Napoleon wasn't executed, whereas Ney was. Exactly,
which is in itself a great pity. But anyway,
when I say a better man, I think he was a more straight man.
A more honourable man, you might say.
A more honourable man who wouldn't have killed so many Frenchmen.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. No, I do disagree with that at all. But as for Shillings, myself and Mr. Majesty have just in the last couple of weeks have finished our orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality series, which culminated in a final stream about the Greeks and their participation in the Balkan Wars and World War One, and their failed attempt to, you might say, capture the Eastern Aegean in the aftermath of World War One and the loss of Constantinople.
That was an excellent stream. I've seen it. Do go and watch it, guys. It was really good.
Exactly. And as we know, AM's research and his writing is just peerless. He's very good at what he does, and it's an honor to be on the streams with him.
100%.
And also, the second part of that was obviously to study the Russian impact on World War One, and obviously the aftermath of that, which is the October Revolution and the civil war between the Whites and the Reds, and you might say the destruction of the Romanov dynasty at the hands of the Bolsheviks, and those two streams are quite actually heartbreaking when put together. So that was the end of that series, which is being brought to a culmination. In recent times, I have streamed with Hitman. We've done part 1, and part 2 will occur, I believe, towards the end of this month or at the beginning of July. We are talking about Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck and his campaign in German East Africa. His
Tanzania, basically,
which is a fantastic, military adventure for anyone who is fascinated in military history. The exploits of von Lettow-Vorbeck in East Africa are simply astonishing, and so it's been fantastic.
There's a good novel. There's a good novel, Furious, called The Ice Cream War, which is about that campaign.
Oh, is it? I'd never.
I can't remember the author's name now, but I read it years ago when I was like about, I don't know, 20, 21. It's called The Ice Cream War. It's pretty good, actually.
I'll have to check it out. So we've been covering his account, My Reminiscences of Africa, and part 2 will follow sometime next month. So tune in for that. And the other thing I'll say is because I sadly always miss every opportunity to come on your splendid isolation streams, Andrew, but I did appreciate the invite for Waterloo stream. This has been a fantastic stream as always, and thank you for asking me to come on, and thank you for the chat for listening in.
Furious, you're one of my favorite military historians because I don't see you making many obvious mistakes, which many so-called military historians do. You don't make many. That's why I'd happily do a 2 or 3 stream series with you on Caesar, because I think you actually understand what was going on then. Sorry, Karen.
No, just saying thank you. No, thank you very much. It's very, very kind of you to say.
Thank you very much for Rupert August. I've done several streams with Rupert now. I think he's a great historical guy, understands a great deal about history. Do go and check him out. Thank you very much to Furius Pertinax. Again, like I said, Furius Pertinax is one of my favorite military historians on YouTube because most of them make stupid errors and Furious very seldom does. I'm going to play us out with a tune. So here we go. Okay, that was Wellington's march from Patriotic Archives. Excellent channel. If you like military music from Britain and the old Commonwealth and other nations, do go and check out Patriotic Archives channel. And before we go, we did get one super chat, and that was from Josephina Herringway. Forgive my pronunciation. Who for USD $15 says thank you for another great stream. I'm not sure how many great streams I've done. If this was a great stream, it was because of my guests, not because of me. So yeah, thank you very much, Josephina. I know you're a very good lady. And so yeah, hopefully we'll be back with another stream soon. And I definitely want to do that 2 or 3 stream series with Furius about Caesar. I think that would be very interesting. And if that goes well, then I might do one about Marcus Aurelius, who is my favorite Roman emperor and general. So yeah, we'll see. Thank you very much, Rupert August. Thank you very much, Furious Pertinax. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for joining, and we'll see you soon. And happy Waterloo Day to all of you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Thank you and take care. Cheers.